I had never seen the sky split open like that, even in the stories the old timers told around campfires. One moment, the forest was humming with the usual evening chorus, cicadas droning, pine needles whispering under a light wind, and then the storm hit. It wasn't just rain. It was a violence that felt alive, a roar of thunder that rattled through my chest like the earth itself was exhaling rage. I'm 34, been camping alone in these woods for years, and I thought I understood the patterns, the streams, the rock ledges, the way the wind shifted over the canyon. But that night, nothing made sense. I remember clutching the sides of my small Volkswagen camper, gripping it as if the storm could shake me into another dimension. When the downpour finally lessened, I stepped out into the after-dark, mud-slicked forest, and the air smelled of wet cedar and ozone, the kind of smell that burrows into your bones and leaves you wondering if this world is the one you thought you knew. I was with 3 others, all local hikers who had invited me to explore a canyon deep in the Cascades. We joked about how remote this trail was, how sometimes the maps didn't even line up with the ground. But the laughter vanished as we stumbled through the waterlogged path, each of us soaked to the skin, boots caked in mud, the smell of rain and earth clinging to everything. Then, when we reached the edge of the canyon, I froze. Across the deep chasm where only yesterday there had been a gap of sheer rock and brush, there was a bridge, wooden, freshly built, or perhaps conjured, and it stretched from one side to the other like it had always been there, yet none of us remembered it. My companions murmured in disbelief. No one had seen it before. The wood glistened wet in the lingering fog, planks slightly uneven, rope handrails swaying with the wind. I know the logical part of your mind wants to say it was the storm, debris forming a makeshift crossing, but my gut told me something else. Something impossible. I went first, partly out of curiosity, partly because I didn't want the others to suspect my unease. My first steps were tentative, the boards creaking under weight I couldn't reconcile with the silence of the canyon. Beneath me, water thrashed far below, an invisible river that swallowed echoes whole. Each step forward felt like moving through a memory I hadn't lived yet. My friends stayed behind, calling encouragement, but their voices started to fade, swallowed by the canyon's roar and the fog curling around the edges. Midway across, I looked down, or maybe I thought I did, and caught a glimpse of the world beneath the planks, shifting in ways that weren't normal. Shadows bent against gravity, water gleamed like glass, but rippled like it was liquid light. My heart pounded, not just from fear, but from the undeniable thrill that I was seeing something beyond what was supposed to be. And then, just as I reached the center, I felt the bridge shiver under me. Not a creak or groan, but a ripple through the air itself. I turned to see my friends' faces through the mist, but their forms were stretched, elongated in ways that made my stomach twist. They waved, calling my name, and yet as I blinked, the space between us seemed to widen, the chasm growing, even though the land around them hadn't moved. I took another step, and suddenly the world snapped in a way that stole my breath. My body felt light, too light, like gravity itself had loosened its grip. One second I was walking, the next I was falling, not into the canyon, but into a space that seemed suspended between dimensions. My friends' shouts faded, becoming almost underwater in their clarity. Panic rose, but it wasn't just the fear of falling. It was the terror of vanishing, of leaving one world for another that no one could follow. When I landed, it was silent. The bridge was gone, or perhaps it had never been solid in the first place. I was on the other side of the canyon alone. The forest here was different. The trees taller, older, and the fog clinging to the underbrush in thick, deliberate layers. There was no trail, no sign of human passage, and yet I could feel the echo of my own crossing in the soil, as if the earth remembered me stepping where it should not have been. Panic pressed against my chest, but curiosity held me rooted. The sky above was clearing, the storm clouds receding, revealing the pale light of dawn. I could hear birds somewhere in the distance, but their songs were not the cheerful notes I was used to. They were deliberate, almost knowing, carrying a rhythm that suggested watchfulness, judgment, or maybe welcome. I walked forward, unsure of whether to retrace the bridge, search for my friends, or simply surrender to whatever reality I had stumbled into. Hours passed, or was it days? Time moved differently here, stretched thin and thick all at once. Every step I took left impressions in the soil, yet the forest seemed to close behind me, reshaping trails I thought I knew. Shadows hung longer, and shapes at the periphery of my vision flickered with impossible motions, moving against the wind or gravity. I tried calling my friends' names, but my voice echoed back as if mocking me, each repetition twisting into something unrecognizable. And yet, with all the fear, I felt something else, a pull deeper into the forest, like the land itself was whispering secrets of survival, resilience, and the kind of courage that only surfaces when you realize there is no one to rely on but yourself. I began to understand, not with my mind but with my bones, that fear is not always a warning. It is a teacher. I found water from a spring that didn't exist on any map, fish in pools that shimmered with impossible colors, and shelter in caves carved by time into shapes that reminded me of human hands reaching out from the earth. Every choice, every instinct I followed became a measure of who I was when stripped of certainty. And through it all, I thought constantly of my friends, of the side of the canyon where I had vanished. I wanted to run back, to demand answers from the world that had betrayed me, but the deeper I went, the more I realized that running back was an illusion. The bridge had chosen me, or perhaps the storm had, and this place, the forest, the canyon, the impossible quiet, was meant to teach me something I could not learn by walking ordinary trails. There were moments of pure terror, of course. Nights when the fog thickened to the point where I could not see my own hands, when shadows moved independently and sounds of footsteps echoed too close for comfort. I often awoke to the feeling of being watched, the hairs on my arms prickling in response to something unseen brushing past. Yet even in the heart of fear, there was beauty, moss glowing faintly under moonlight, trees that seemed to breathe, and the occasional deer whose eyes met mine in silent understanding. I learned to move with patience, to notice subtleties, to listen to the forest in ways I never had before. Every day demanded focus, resilience, and intuition. It was on the third night that I finally understood the truth of the bridge. I had climbed to the top of a ridge, a vantage point overlooking the canyon I had crossed, and I saw it. A shimmer in the morning haze, faint but unmistakable. Not a bridge this time, but a presence, a force that connected worlds in ways that defied logic. I realized that the bridge was never meant to carry me back. It had carried me forward, into the unknown, and into a version of myself that could survive what others could not. The lesson was clear, though it did not feel like comfort. Sometimes, to find your strength, you must step into the impossible, into the terror, into the isolation where fear becomes guidance and courage emerges uninvited. I never saw my friends again. Search parties found nothing. The canyon looked exactly as it had the day before the storm, with no sign of a bridge, no sign of me. And yet, the forest kept me. It tested me. It reshaped me. In the quiet moments when the sun pierces the canopy just so, I hear their voices, not calling but echoing, reminding me that some passages are meant to be walked alone. Standing at the edge of a cliff, watching mist coil like smoke over the trees, I know that fear and wonder share the same path. That storm was not an end. It was the opening of a road I never expected, a bridge that only appeared for those willing to step beyond certainty. And I stepped. The forest didn't let me rest. Even as I thought I had adapted to its strange rhythms, each day revealed new challenges that tested my resolve. Trails that seemed solid would vanish mid-step, replaced by thick brambles or sudden drops that weren't on any map. Streams I had used to gauge direction appeared and disappeared like mirages, reflecting skies that sometimes seemed darker than the night I had crossed the bridge. At first, panic bubbled beneath my calm exterior. I would pause for hours, listening to the wind weaving through the pines, trying to find some anchor in the chaos. But over time, I began to notice patterns, not in the way humans chart maps, but in the way the forest spoke to me. A moss line pointing me along safer paths, a change in bird calls that signaled danger, even the subtle vibration of the soil that hinted at water or unstable ground. Fear had become a guide, a teacher, a companion as real as the ghostly echo of the bridge. On one afternoon, I discovered a canyon side that glowed under the low sun, walls slick with rain yet etched with vertical grooves that looked unnervingly like runes. I was drawn to it, not by curiosity alone, but by an instinct I didn't understand. The rocks hummed faintly under my fingers, a vibration that seemed alive, pulsing like the beat of a heart hidden inside the earth. I realized that the canyon had layers I could sense but not see. Every step I took made me aware of my smallness, yet also of my capacity to move carefully, deliberately, through the unknown. It was a lesson in humility and courage simultaneously. The forest wasn't just a landscape, it was a living teacher, challenging me to recognize that survival wasn't measured by escaping fear, but by engaging it fully. As days blurred into nights, the psychological weight of isolation pressed harder. Shadows that had once been distant, almost playful, began to manifest closer to me. Movement at the edges of my vision became undeniable, though nothing concrete emerged. I spoke aloud, trying to anchor myself in familiar reality. I am here. I am real. The words felt hollow, yet necessary, a tether to the human world I had left behind on the other side of the bridge. I thought constantly of my friends, the ones who had called my name that night, their faces distorted in memory by fog and fear. Did they see me vanish? Did they even know what I had crossed? The idea that I had entered a place outside comprehension gnawed at me, but it also forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. The universe had given me a moment of choice, and I had taken it. No one else could share this path. No one else could understand the bridge in the way I now did. One night, as the moon rose and cast long, spectral shadows over the undergrowth, I found myself at a shallow pool of water that mirrored the stars above. The reflection was perfect, yet wrong. Constellations shifted subtly, as though someone or something had redrawn the sky to fit this world. I knelt beside the pool, my reflection breaking with each ripple of movement, and in the silent, mirrored surface, I saw not just my face, but the outline of the bridge superimposed behind me, fragile and trembling. The realization struck me like lightning. The bridge had not disappeared entirely. It existed as a liminal thing, appearing only when conditions aligned, carrying only those who could accept the risk, and vanishing when the world tried to reclaim its boundaries. It was a threshold, not a passage, and crossing it once meant irrevocable transformation. The emotional weight of that knowledge was crushing. Loneliness had become a companion, fear a teacher, and the forest itself a mirror of my inner state. There were moments when despair rose with a suffocating clarity, when I thought I might scream into the fog and have no one hear, and yet those moments also became exercises in endurance. I learned to pace my breath, to notice the faintest shifts in wind, to trust the instinctual compass that had guided me this far. The bridge had given me a gift, an unparalleled confrontation with uncertainty. But with that gift came responsibility. Responsibility to move deliberately, to observe, to grow. The forest demanded engagement, not escape. Weeks passed, or what felt like weeks, and I began to notice the subtle ways the forest was changing in response to me. Trails that had been treacherous became manageable when approached with attention. Creatures that had skittishly avoided me now tolerated my presence. It was as if the land itself was testing my capacity for respect and mindfulness. Every encounter, whether with a shadow, a rustle in the underbrush, or the eerie stillness of an abandoned clearing, was a lesson in perception. I realized I was learning to inhabit two worlds simultaneously: the physical, tangible forest I could touch and see, and the liminal, almost supernatural layer that allowed the bridge to appear, disappear, and carry travelers into unknown consequences. To survive here, meant respecting both realms. Then, one morning, I saw it again. A shimmer across the canyon, faint but distinct, like sunlight refracted through morning fog. My pulse quickened. The bridge, or whatever form it took, was there, suspended across the abyss, seemingly waiting. I approached cautiously, aware that crossing again would not return me to what I had left behind. It would carry me deeper, farther, perhaps to a place from which no one ever returned. But in that moment, the choice felt clear. Hesitation had kept me alive, but courage, measured, deliberate courage, would allow me to understand. I stepped forward, one foot onto the trembling wood, feeling the same mix of terror and exhilaration as the first crossing. This time the forest seemed to exhale as I moved. Fog swirled beneath me in slow, deliberate eddies, and the sound of rushing water faded into a distant hum, almost melodic. Each plank felt more solid, yet more alive, responding to my weight with subtle recognition. Halfway across, I glanced down, not into the chasm, but into a reflection of the other side, where trees and cliffs shifted and twisted in impossible angles. My friends' voices echoed faintly, though I could not distinguish words, a reminder that this passage was no longer for them, but for me. I realized then that the bridge's gift was not passage, it was perspective. Crossing felt like moving through memory and possibility at once. The wind carried whispers of advice I hadn't known I needed. Patience, observation, humility. It was not fear that guided me now, but understanding. Each step was an exercise in balance, in awareness, in listening to forces beyond comprehension. When I reached the other side, the bridge disappeared entirely, leaving only the forest, undisturbed and silent. The air smelled different here, clearer, lighter, and yet heavy with the weight of knowledge. I stood there, trembling, not from fear, but from the raw intensity of having touched something beyond ordinary existence. I had been changed irrevocably. And now, years later, when I speak of that night and the bridge that appeared after the storm, I do not speak of fear alone. I speak of transformation. I speak of the way the forest teaches lessons through silence, patience, and the impossible. The bridge was a doorway, yes, but it was also a mirror, a challenge, and a revelation. I learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the deliberate choice to move through it. That true understanding comes from engagement, not avoidance, and that sometimes the paths we most fear are the ones that will define us forever. The forest did not let me linger in comfort. Even standing on that quiet ridge, after crossing the bridge for the second time, I felt its presence pressing in, an awareness that I was no longer simply a hiker or a camper, but a participant in something older than memory, older than maps, older than human reckoning. The wind whispered lessons through the pines. Patience, humility, attentiveness. Every branch, every ripple of mist across the canyon carried meaning. I realized I had been wandering in two worlds, the tangible, familiar one of trails and rivers, and the subtle, unseen one that could conjure a bridge out of nothing. Understanding this duality did not make the forest less frightening. It made it infinitely more profound. Fear and awe were inseparable. To survive here, to truly learn from the experience, I had to embrace both. That night, I made camp on a ledge above a creek that sang with gentle persistence. I watched the water reflect the moon, silvery and impossible, and I thought of my friends, the ones who had vanished from the other side of the canyon. I mourned them, not in anger, not in disbelief, but in quiet acknowledgement that some journeys are solitary, that some lessons are only revealed when the world narrows around you. The bridge had chosen me, or perhaps the storm had, and I had answered that call. Survival had become more than endurance. It had become a dialogue between myself and the forest, a rhythm of respect, attention, and courage. In the days that followed, I explored further, tracing faint paths and discovering hidden clearings that seemed alive in a different way from the lands I had known. Moss glowed faintly under my fingertips. Trees arched with deliberate grace over trails that bent reality. Small animals, normally skittish, observed me with steady eyes, as though they recognized my transformation. I began to see the world as a layered place, where ordinary perception was only the beginning. Every sound, shadow, and shift of wind carried information. Fear was no longer a mere warning. It was a signal, a guide, a teacher. And yet, the deeper I ventured, the more I realized that the bridge's lesson extended beyond the physical world. It was a test of integrity, of patience, of the capacity to face isolation, uncertainty, and the unknown without surrendering to despair. One afternoon, I climbed a ridge overlooking the canyon where I had first seen the bridge. The fog lay like a silver sheet in the chasm, and for a moment I felt the old panic rising, the memory of vanishing, of falling into impossibility, but it was tempered by the knowledge I had gained. I was no longer the same person who had first stepped onto the wet planks. I had endured the forest's trials, listened to its silent counsel, and discovered strength in solitude and observation. And then, as the sun broke through the fog in long golden beams, I saw it, a shimmer on the opposite side, faint but unmistakable. A bridge, perhaps, or perhaps a memory of one. My heart leapt, but I did not rush. I watched, absorbed the details, recognized the impermanence, and understood. The bridge was never a promise of passage. It was an invitation to engage fully with fear, to step into uncertainty, and to emerge transformed. The realization brought clarity that no trail marker or map could have provided. I understood that the forest, with all its terrors and wonders, was a mirror of life itself, unpredictable, demanding, unforgiving, and yet capable of revealing courage and wisdom in those willing to face it honestly. The bridge that appeared after the storm was not merely wood spanning a canyon. It was a threshold, a symbol, a confrontation with the self. Every creak of the planks, every shadow cast by fog and moonlight, every echo of my friends' voices in memory had been a lesson in attention, humility, and the kind of courage that transforms fear into understanding. I camped that night knowing the forest had given me a gift few ever receive. A glimpse of the extraordinary, a test of endurance, and an encounter with the liminal spaces where fear, courage, and wisdom intersect. I understood now that stepping onto that bridge, vanishing from one reality into another, was not a loss, but a necessary passage. The forest had demanded trust, and I had delivered it. Standing there, listening to the whisper of pines and the distant roar of water far below, I realized something profound. Life, like the bridge, appears only when circumstances demand it, often after storms, often after fear, and always at the precise moment when you are ready. As dawn broke, spilling soft light across moss, stone, and fog, I knew I could return to the trails I had known before, but I would never be the same. The forest had rewritten my understanding of courage, patience, and perception. It had shown me that fear, when acknowledged and engaged, is not a barrier, but a teacher, that solitude can be a crucible for wisdom, that the impossible, bridges appearing across chasms, paths vanishing, time bending, is not always a threat, but an opportunity. And in the quiet moments when wind lifts leaves and sunlight glimmers through the trees, I sense the bridge still exists, somewhere in the folds of the world, waiting for those who are ready to learn that true passage is as much about transformation as it is about survival. I carry that knowledge now, not as a story to frighten, but as a lesson to inspire. The bridge that appeared after the storm taught me that the world is wider, deeper, and stranger than we imagine. That the line between fear and wisdom is thin, and walking it requires courage. That some journeys demand we step into uncertainty fully, trusting not in the ground beneath us, but in the lessons we carry within. And though I never saw my friends again, I honor them in every careful step I take, in every whisper of the wind, in every shadow that reminds me that life's most profound truths often appear in the spaces between fear and understanding. The forest remains. It waits, it tests, it teaches. And for those willing to step forward, to confront the storms, to face the unknown without certainty, it offers a gift greater than any path or map could ever show. The chance to discover the strength, clarity, and courage that have always been inside, waiting to be revealed. I want you to feel this, as if the forest itself is speaking through me. There is a quiet majesty in vanishing and stepping into the unknown. Standing on the far side of that canyon, the one my friends never crossed, I realized that life does not always grant a return ticket. Some bridges appear not to bring you back, but to carry you forward, into clarity, into strength, into a version of yourself you cannot reach by standing still. The wind moved differently there, alive with intention, carrying scents of cedar, rain, and something older than memory, something elemental. I understood in that moment that the bridge was not a threat, it was a teacher. It demanded trust, demanded awareness, demanded surrender to the rhythm of life beyond comfort. And when I surrendered, I felt something shift deep inside me, a quiet alchemy of courage, insight, and reverence. The bridge, the storm, the canyon, they were mirrors reflecting the parts of me I had ignored. The fear that gripped my chest when the boards creaked, the confusion when my friends' voices blurred with the fog, the sheer vertigo of disappearing from one side of the world to another, it was all an invitation to see clearly, to recognize the fragility of certainty and the extraordinary power of engagement with the unknown. I had always thought courage was about confronting danger head-on, but here I learned it is far subtler. Courage is a dialogue with the forest, with the fear, with yourself. It is noticing the small details, the way moss bends underfoot, the rhythm of birds in the mist, the shifting angles of light across a canyon, and trusting that observation is as vital as any act of heroism. I carried on through the forest for weeks, moving with deliberate care, learning to read the invisible cues that spoke of water, shelter, and safety. Shadows became companions, not enemies. Fog became a map of possibility rather than a threat. Each step reinforced a lesson I could not unlearn. The world is alive with patterns and intention, and it responds to the focus, humility, and courage you bring. It is unforgiving, yes, but in its unforgiving nature, it offers clarity. I had vanished once, literally, and in that vanishing, I discovered how to truly inhabit presence. Every sound, every shadow, every shifting leaf taught me resilience, patience, and trust in the subtle, unseen forces that govern life. When I finally emerged from the depths of that forest, back into sunlight that seemed too bright after weeks of shadow and fog, I understood something essential. The bridge had not merely taken me across a canyon. It had carried me across the limitations of perception, fear, and self-doubt. It had shown me that to step into the unknown is to engage with life itself in its most raw, transformative form. I never saw my friends again. I cannot know what became of them, but I carry them in memory as reminders that some journeys are shared only in thought and intention, and some must be walked alone to extract the deepest lessons. Now, when I return to ordinary trails, when I hear storms rumbling across distant mountains, when I feel the fog curling through trees, I remember that night. I remember the bridge, the storm, the canyon, and the raw, piercing clarity of stepping into what is unknown and emerging changed. The forest taught me that fear is not an enemy, but a guide, that solitude is not loneliness, but an opportunity, and that transformation waits not in comfort, but in the trembling uncertainty of a path you cannot see. That knowledge, the quiet, enduring understanding of the bridge, the storm, and the canyon remains with me every day. So when you step into the woods, when the storm breaks overhead and the sky rumbles like a living thing, do not simply seek shelter. Listen, observe, feel. Allow fear to teach you rather than paralyze you. Watch for the impossible, for the hidden thresholds, for the moments when a bridge may appear, not to return you to what you know, but to carry you toward the person you are capable of becoming. And if you vanish, even for a moment, into the unknown, trust that the forest, the storm, and the bridge are not punishing you. They are showing you what it means to endure, to engage, and to grow. Life, like that canyon, is vast and deep, and sometimes terrifying. But if you are willing to step forward, to listen, to observe, and to trust yourself in the presence of the unknown, you will discover that courage, clarity, and transformation are waiting for you on the far side. And when you finally stand there, looking back at the bridge that appeared after the storm, you will realize that the world is wider, stranger, and more alive than you ever imagined, and that the greatest journey you can take is the one that takes you through fear, into the extraordinary, and finally into yourself. I should have trusted my hesitation that morning. I should have listened to that strange heaviness in my chest, the one that felt almost like grief, as I locked my apartment door behind me and slung my pack onto my shoulders. But the truth is, I'd been ignoring my instincts for years. That was half the reason I'd started hiking alone in the first place. Out in the woods, far from work deadlines and glowing screens and all the little ways modern life drains you, I could finally hear my own thoughts. At least, that's what I told myself. The trail I chose ran through a stretch of forest most people avoided unless they were seasoned backpackers. It didn't have a spooky reputation or anything cheap like that. It was simply untouched, dense, quiet, a place you entered with respect because the forest didn't care if you were there or not. And for once, that indifference was exactly what I wanted. My plan was simple. 2 days in, camp near the ridge, 2 days out. I had enough food, enough water, and gear that had never failed me. When I parked at the nearly empty trailhead and stepped out of the car, the air felt clean in my lungs, cold enough to bite, but not enough to warn. My boots sank slightly into the damp soil, pine needles cushioning every step, and beyond the lot stretched miles of forest waiting to swallow me whole. I remember standing there for a moment, pack in hand, listening, really listening to what the woods sounded like before a human presence disturbed it. A crow croaked somewhere unseen. Wind stirred the canopy. A stream gurgled faintly in the distance. It all seemed normal. Yet even then, I felt it, a subtle imbalance in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook it off, tightened the straps on my pack, and headed out. I'd been hiking since my early 20s, long enough to know the difference between ordinary wilderness silence and something deeper, more alert. The first few miles were familiar. Trail markers nailed into tree trunks, the earthy scent of cedar and moss, the occasional scamper of something small darting beneath the ferns. I passed the first fork in the trail and veered right toward the route few weekend hikers took. I didn't see a single person after that. The solitude felt good for a while. The trail dipped into a narrow valley where the light thinned and the temperature dropped enough for my breath to mist. I pulled my compass out from the clip on my chest strap, more out of habit than necessity. North, as expected. I checked it against the map, then continued on, noting how the forest seemed older here. The trees grew thicker, their bark rough like cracked stone. The air smelled of rain, even though the sky was mostly clear. By the time I reached the moss-covered boulder that marked the halfway point for my first day's hike, a faint drizzle had begun to patter through the branches. I stopped to take a sip of water and adjust my hood. That was when I first noticed the silence. Not the quiet of a forest settling in for weather, not the hush of distant storm clouds. This silence felt intentional, manufactured, as if every sound had been pulled out of the air. The hair on my arms rose beneath my sleeves. I told myself it was just the weather shift. I started walking again, but the feeling trailed after me, clinging to my back like a shadow. A few hours later, rain still whispering overhead, I reached the ridge where I planned to camp. The clearing was small but flat, shielded by a ring of cedar trees on 3 sides. I'd camped in places like it dozens of times. I unpacked, set up my tent, hung my food, and built a small fire in the makeshift pit someone else had used months before. The normal motions calmed me a little, almost enough to forget about that pocket of strange silence. Almost. But when night settled over the ridge, thicker and darker than I expected, the unease returned, threading itself through my nerves like cold wire. I was finishing my ramen when I heard it for the first time. Not a branch cracking, not a distant animal call, a whisper. My name. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. The rain had stopped hours earlier, leaving the air still and damp. My fire hissed softly, a little wet from the earlier drizzle. Every sound was distinct, so when something breathed my name, Soft, close, almost regretful. I heard it clearly. I turned toward the trees, heart thudding, expecting, I don't know, another hiker? A lost camper? But nothing moved. "Hello?" I called out before I could stop myself. My voice sounded too loud, too shaky. No response. Of course there wasn't. This was deep forest, remote, unmapped in places. The odds of another person being there were slim. My rational brain told me I'd imagined it, just the wind playing tricks or maybe a stray memory surfacing at the wrong time. I tried to shake it off, but the whisper had been too precise, too close, too much like a person leaning just over my shoulder. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I started to drift off, I jolted awake, convinced someone was standing just outside the tent. At around 3 in the morning, the temperature dropped enough that I could see my own breath, even inside the tent. And somewhere in the darkness, something moved through the underbrush with slow, deliberate steps. I didn't unzip the flap. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Eventually, the footsteps faded. I sat awake until dawn. When the sun finally broke through the canopy and washed the forest in thin gold light, I felt foolish, exhausted and jumpy, but foolish. I stepped out of the tent to make coffee, stretching the ache out of my shoulders. That's when I saw it. My compass. I always clipped it to my pack before going to sleep. I knew I had. I'd done it instinctively, like I had every night for years. But now it lay several feet away, directly in the center of the clearing, resting atop a patch of flattened pine needles, as if someone had placed it there. I walked toward it slowly, every part of me tightening. My breath missed it again, even though the morning should have been warming the air. The compass needle was spinning, not lazily or unevenly, the way a cheap compass sometimes does when it's damaged. No, this was fast, aggressive, whirling so quickly the metal blurred. I crouched down, hesitant to touch it. My fingers hovered above it, the cold of the metal radiating upward like it had been left in ice. Then it stopped, abruptly, locked in one direction. I followed the line of the needle with my eyes, straight into the trees, straight toward where the whisper had come from the night before. A chill crawled up my spine. Maybe it's broken, I muttered to myself, but broken compasses don't spin violently 1 second and point with unwavering certainty the next. Broken compasses don't end up in places you didn't put them. Broken compasses don't make you feel watched. I should have packed up then. Should have turned back. Should have listened to the fear flickering at the base of my throat. But years of hiking had carved a flaw into me. A stubborn refusal to overreact to anything I couldn't explain. So instead of running like I should have, I clipped the compass back to my strap, made coffee with trembling hands, and tried to pretend nothing strange had happened. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was waiting for something. Waiting for me. The trail ahead led deeper into the woods, toward a stretch of land the map only outlined vaguely. I'd planned to take it to reach a ridge on the far side, but now, every time I glanced down, the compass needle pointed unwaveringly toward that same direction, even when I faced south, even when I reversed the compass, even when I stood still. North didn't exist anymore, apparently. Only that direction. The whisper's direction. I should have turned back. Instead, I stared into the trees for a long, breathless moment, then tightened my pack and stepped forward, because something about that direction felt like a question waiting to be answered, or a trap waiting to be sprung. I didn't know which one yet, but I was about to find out. The first 100 yards felt like every other hike I'd ever taken. My boots found their rhythm. My breathing steadied. The trees closed in around me, their branches knitting overhead like a dark net. But the compass on my chest strap pulled at my awareness with every step, its locked needle an accusation, a dare, a command. I kept glancing at it. North didn't matter anymore. My map didn't matter anymore. The needle pointed at something deeper in the forest, something I couldn't see. And despite everything I'd felt the night before, some stubborn part of me wanted to understand why. The deeper I went, the stranger the woods became. The air thickened, not with humidity, but with weight, like walking into a room where someone had been crying. The forest looked normal enough, ferns, cedar trunks, fallen branches, but something felt off balance, as if every tree leaned subtly toward me, listening. By the time I reached a shallow ravine, the sun had broken through the canopy in fractured beams, lighting up the air with drifting particles of dust and pollen. I paused, studying the ground for signs of old trails or game paths. There was nothing. No footprints, no worn-down soil, no sign that anything larger than a squirrel had passed through recently. And yet, the compass claimed this was the only direction that mattered. I swallowed, feeling the dryness in my throat, and climbed down into the ravine. The earth was damp and soft, sucking faintly at my boots. The smell of wet decay rose around me, mushrooms, moss, the rot of fallen logs melting back into the ground. Every sound I made felt too loud, like the forest didn't want me disturbing its secrets. At one point I stopped, realizing I hadn't heard a single bird since I'd left camp. Not one. The silence wasn't total, but nearly so. Only the whisper of wind brushing past brittle branches, and then, as if to remind me that I wasn't alone, something answered that silence. A whisper. My name. Not loud, not close, but unmistakable. I spun around, heart lurching. The voice came from beyond the ravine, deeper into the woods, carried faintly on the shifting air. Somehow, impossibly, it sounded even farther away than the night before, like it was retreating, luring me on. My hand hovered over the compass, still pointing the same direction. Toward the voice. A cold ripple moved beneath my skin. I didn't call back. I didn't dare. Instead, I took a slow breath and crossed the ravine, climbing the opposite side with clumsy, trembling steps. Hours passed. I wasn't following a trail anymore. I was following an instruction. The forest grew denser the farther I went, branches grabbing at my sleeves, roots snaking across the ground like warning lines. I checked the compass constantly, half hoping it would suddenly point north again and release me from whatever invisible pull I'd stepped into. But it stayed fixed. Unwavering. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion set in, not from the distance, but from the tension gripping my muscles. I stopped in a small clearing, the only place I'd seen that offered a patch of sunlight. My shoulders ached from the pack, my mind churned. I shrugged off the straps and let the pack drop to the ground, kneeling beside it. When I reached for my water bottle, something caught my eye. Movement at the edge of the clearing. A flicker. A shadow. A figure. I jerked upright as a shape slipped behind a tree, too tall to be an animal, too fluid to be wind against a branch. My breath froze in my throat. I took one step toward it, then stopped myself, because everything in me screamed that approaching was the wrong choice. Instead, I listened. The forest held its breath again. Then, again, faintly, impossibly, my name drifted across the clearing, whispered, ragged, urgent. The voice didn't sound human anymore. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. Then the whisper came again, closer this time. Still disembodied, still not tied to anything I could see. My skin prickled as the voice shifted, almost like it was testing its own shape, trying to figure out how a human throat produced sound. I backed up slowly until my calf hit my pack. This time, I didn't pick it up. I snatched it. I clipped the compass to my strap with shaking fingers, refusing to look at it again, and fled the clearing. The terrain sloped upward, roots forming natural stairs that led deeper into the older part of the forest. The trees here were massive, ancient things with bark so thick it looked like armor, moss draped from their branches like rotting cloth. The air tasted different too, tinged with minerals and cold earth that reminded me of caves. I'd hiked alone for years, but never once had I felt like the forest was corralling me, nudging me onto paths I didn't choose. The compass needle never wavered, even when I tried walking in a different direction. It pulled at my awareness like a string tightening around my ribs. Eventually, I reached a ridge that overlooked a valley so choked with mist I couldn't see the bottom. The sight was strangely beautiful, ghostly even, but the beauty did nothing to quiet the fear buzzing under my skin. The voice called again. Not my name this time, just a sound, drawn out, syllable-less, almost like breath forming a question. I felt it vibrate through the cold air. I hated how it made me feel. not terrified, not startled, claimed. I forced myself to step back from the ridge, away from the whispering fog. I needed distance, space to think, anywhere except above that sound. I set up my tent a ways back among a cluster of fir trees, my hands clumsy inside my gloves. By the time dusk bled through the branches, my nerves were stretched thin. Every crunch of pine needles snapped my attention sideways. Every darkening shape between the trees felt like something watching. I built a small fire, more for comfort than warmth, and sat with my knees pulled to my chest, waiting for night to swallow the forest. It didn't take long. Once darkness settled, it moved thick and complete, no stars visible through the canopy. The fire's glow felt pitifully small. The woods around me stretched into miles of endless black. I was pouring hot water into a meal pouch when I heard the whisper again. Not faint, not distant, close, too close. It came from just beyond the light of the fire, barely 10 feet away. My fingers froze around the pouch, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper came again, this time distorted, almost doubled, like more than one voice struggling to speak through the same throat. I didn't turn my head. I didn't look. I just stared into the fire, every muscle locked. Slowly, I reached one hand toward the compass on my chest, desperate to see what it was doing. My fingertips brushed the cold metal. The compass needle was pointing directly behind me, toward the whisper. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Then, a twig snapped. The sound was soft, but unmistakable. Something was standing just outside the firelight. I forced myself to turn my head, inch by inch, toward the sound. My breath stuttered in my chest. The shadows moved. A shape leaned between the trees, a tall, thin outline, too long-limbed to be human, too still to be an animal. It stood perfectly motionless, its form barely visible except when the fire crackled and cast flickers of orange across the trunks. I blinked once. The shape was gone. But the whisper wasn't. It came from the opposite direction now. Then from behind me. Then right next to my ear. I lurched away from the spot, nearly tripping over my own pack. The voice chased my movement, circling the fire, weaving between trees like something crawling too quickly for its body to follow. At one point it said my name again, this time stretched and broken, as if dragged across cracking ice. A deep, instinctive wrongness swelled inside me. This thing wasn't lost. This thing wasn't calling me for help. It was calling me because it knew me. When the whisper stopped, the silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I backed into my tent and zipped it closed with shaking hands. I didn't lie down. I didn't sleep. I pressed my back against my pack and watched the silhouette of the fire through the thin fabric, waiting for something, anything to move outside. Sometime after midnight, the fire died. The tent turned cold, and somewhere in the suffocating darkness, something brushed against the outer wall of the tent. Not an animal, a hand, slow, deliberate, curious. The compass on my chest vibrated against my sternum as if the metal were humming. Then it spun. Rapidly, violently, whirling until I could hear the needle scraping against the glass. I pressed my hand over it, trying to still it. It didn't stop, not until the whisper crawled through the fabric of the tent and breathed my name, so close I felt the warmth of a mouth that wasn't mine. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I sat there, rigid and shaking, listening to the forest breathe around me, waiting for the moment the whisper turned into hands that pulled the tent open. But the moment never came. Instead, something far worse happened. The compass needle stopped spinning, then locked, pointing straight forward, as if whatever was outside had moved to stand directly in front of the tent. I couldn't see it, I couldn't hear it, but I felt it, waiting, listening, learning. I stayed awake until dawn, heart hammering, breath shallow, pulse trembling through every part of me. I knew I couldn't stay on that ridge, but as soon as the sun rose through the trees and I dared to unzip the tent, I realized something terrifying. The forest had changed. The clearing didn't look the same. The trees weren't where they had been the night before, and the compass still pointed the same direction, toward the whisper, toward whatever wanted me deeper in the woods. At first light, the forest felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. I crawled out of the tent, legs trembling, breath fogging the morning air, and just stood there for a moment, blinking at the shapes of the trees around me. It was subtle enough that someone fresh to the forest wouldn't have noticed, but I'd spent years hiking alone. I noticed everything. I had to. And the clearing wasn't the same shape it had been the night before. The trees had shifted, not by much, but enough. A cluster of firs that had been several yards to the north now stood closer, forming a tight, uneven arc. The fallen log near my fire pit, the one I'd used as a seat, now lay at a slightly different angle, like someone had nudged it or rotated it while I slept. My brain tried to explain it. Wind, fatigue, memory distortion. But none of those could account for the stripped leaves on the ground that formed a faint, freshly disturbed semicircle around the tent. Like something had paced there, slowly, deliberately, all night. I forced myself to tear my eyes from the clearing and look at the compass, even though dread was already clenching my stomach, still pointing, still locked, still insisting that the only direction in the world worth acknowledging was deeper into the woods, straight through a section of forest that hadn't been on any map. Not today, I whispered to myself. I'm going back. It felt good to say it out loud. Firm, final. Except when I pulled out my map, the path I'd taken up the ridge wasn't where it should have been. The terrain was wrong. Slopes angled differently. Valleys sat where hills should have been. A faint trail that should have been visible was nowhere to be found. I swallowed hard, then turned slowly in a full circle. No trail, no markers, no familiar landmarks, just trees. Endless trees. It was like the entire forest had quietly rearranged itself while I slept, just subtle enough to unmoor my sense of direction, but deliberate enough to keep me locked in place. I stuffed the map into my pocket, hands shaking, and tightened my pack straps. I wasn't going to let panic take over. I'd been lost before, not like this, but enough to know that fear is what kills people. Fear makes you run. Fear makes you miss details. Fear makes you follow the wrong thing. The compass needle glinted in the weak sunlight. Don't follow that, I told myself. Don't you dare follow that. But where else was there to go? I chose what looked like downhill, the general direction I believed would lead me back toward the valley I'd crossed the day before, and began walking. The forest was dense but navigable. I kept my breathing steady, my senses sharp. For nearly an hour, I made good progress, until the forest opened into a clearing with a familiar fallen log, a familiar arc of fir trees, a familiar patch of disturbed earth. My camp. I stood there, stunned. I hadn't looped. I was sure of it. I'd walked in a straight line, downhill, correcting for drift the entire time. There was no way I'd circled back. But the clearing didn't care what I believed. I took 5 steps backward, breath tight in my throat. The compass needle shifted as I moved, pivoting just slightly as if tracking something's movement rather than a direction. Slowly, mechanically, I lifted it. The needle swung and pointed back into the woods again, not toward the way I'd come. Not toward any slope or valley, toward the whisper's direction. A sick feeling hollowed out my stomach. Something wanted me to go that way. Something was hurting me, and I was running out of choices. And as the morning wore on, the forest changed character. The trees grew closer together, their trunks gnarled and crooked like they were straining toward something. Ferns rose in thick blankets along the ground, hiding roots and dips that forced me to watch every step. The air grew cooler, colder, heavier. I checked my watch. It was dead, blank. The screen a flat pane of black. I tapped it once. Nothing. I wasn't surprised. Whatever was happening here didn't respect boundaries, not physical, not mechanical, not mental. Hours passed, though I had no way to measure them, before I reached a section of forest so old it felt like stepping through time. The canopy overhead was nearly solid, letting only thin needles of light pierce through. Moss carpeted everything, clinging to trunks, rocks, even fallen needles, muffling my steps. I was walking carefully, quietly, when I heard the whisper again. This time it didn't call my name. It murmured something unintelligible, something that rose and fell like language, but didn't belong to any mouth shaped like mine. I froze. The whisper came again, closer. Not behind me, not ahead, above. Slowly, fearing what I would see, I lifted my gaze. Something moved among the branches overhead. A shape, a weight. A long, thin silhouette sprawled along a limb as though it had been resting there, waiting. The leaves rustled faintly as it shifted, slowly, deliberately, its limbs bending at angles that weren't human, but almost were. The breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. Neither did it. Not at first. Then its head, or what I assumed was its head, tilted. I couldn't see its face. The branches blocked it, shadows obscuring any detail. But I felt its attention like a cold pressure on my skin, pressing, probing, testing the boundaries of my fear. My pulse thudded loudly in my ears. The creature, or whatever it was, shifted again, and this time the whisper came from it. Not carried on wind, not displaced through trees. It came from the shape itself. A breathy, broken imitation of a voice. My voice. My name, whispered back to me with a wrongness so deep it made my bones ache. I stumbled backward, heart pounding, fumbling to get my hand around the handle of my knife, even though I knew a blade wouldn't do a damn thing. The shadows swallowed the shape. Gone. Vanished. I waited, listened, held my breath. Silence. Only silence. I forced myself to keep moving. I couldn't stay there, not with that thing watching from above. So I followed the compass again, not because I trusted it, but because doing anything else felt worse. At some point, I realized the ground was angling upward again. The trees thinned just enough that I could see slivers of sky, gray, flat, unmoving. The sun should have been high, but the light hadn't changed since I woke. I crossed a stretch of pale, dry soil, a strange break from the forest floor that looked like a long, evaporated stream bed. As I walked across it, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I wasn't alone. Not just watched. Followed. I heard a soft crunch behind me, a footstep, then another. I froze and turned slowly. Nothing, just trees. But the feeling was unmistakable. Something was pacing me, not hiding anymore, not even trying to. The compass needle trembled faintly against its glass cover. I pulled it off the strap and held it flat on my palm. The needle spun once, then stopped, pointing directly behind me, directly where the footsteps had come from. A cold shiver slid through my chest. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew I shouldn't turn around, but I did. At first I saw nothing, just trunks and shadows. Then one of the shadows shifted, tall, still, silent, watching me from between the trees. My breath left my body in a single sharp exhale. I stepped backward. The shadow stepped forward, not in a normal way, not with weight or impact. It simply appeared slightly closer, like a frame jump in a film reel. I stepped again. It followed. A stuttering, wrong movement, a pattern, a mimicry. That thing, whatever it was learning to move like I moved. I bolted. No thought, no plan, just raw instinct. Branches slapped my face and arms. The ground tore at my boots. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The only sound I heard was my own ragged breathing, until something else joined it, a whisper, a rasp, a sound echoing between the trees like breath dragging through hollow spaces, then a scream. Not mine. Not fully human. It was the kind of sound that pierces the spine first, then the mind. A cry full of hunger and mimicry and something older than speech. I ran harder. The forest blurred. My lungs burned. My vision tunneled. But I kept running until my foot caught on a root and I crashed to the ground, sliding across damp soil. I lay there gasping, heart slamming in my chest. For a long moment, I heard nothing. No footsteps. No whisper. No breathing except my own. When I finally pushed myself up on shaking arms and looked around, the forest was still. Too still. Like the trees were holding their breath again. I didn't hear the creature anymore, but the compass did. The needle vibrated faintly, like something was moving at the far edge of its perception, waiting for the moment I made the wrong move. I had no idea where I was. No idea how to get back. Every survival instinct I had told me to stop. To think. To ground myself. But the forest didn't want me grounded, because as I stood up, something new appeared, something that broke whatever hope I had left. A trail, a narrow path cleared of debris, leading forward between two massive cedar trees. It wasn't there 2 minutes before. It couldn't have been. The moss was freshly torn, the soil dark and soft like it had been exposed seconds earlier. Something had made a path. For me, the compass needle turned and pointed straight down that trail. No, 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 no. Everything inside me screamed not to follow it. But the forest behind me felt alive, alert, listening too closely to my hesitation. I turned in a slow circle. No other options, no recognizable terrain. Just the path, just the whisper's direction. Just the promise that something deeper in these woods wanted me specifically, and wasn't finished yet. I took one step toward the path, and the whisper answered. Not from ahead. Not from behind. From everywhere at once. The whisper didn't echo. Echoes need space, boundaries, surfaces to bounce from. This sound had none of that. It came from everywhere and nowhere, like the forest itself was breathing my name into the marrow of the trees. I stood at the mouth of the new trail, my heart pounding so violently I could hear my pulse in my ears. The air was colder here, not the usual chill of morning or altitude. This cold felt purposeful, like stepping into a room someone had been waiting in for a very long time. I clutched the compass harder than I meant to. The needle didn't just point anymore. It trembled, as if responding to something alive. I swallowed the metallic taste rising in my throat and took another step toward the trail. My boots pressed into the soft moss, leaving deep impressions in the fresh soil. The trees on either side leaned subtly inward, forming a narrow corridor. Shadows clung to the path like they were reluctant to let it go. Every part of my mind screamed not to walk into it. But fear traps you more effectively than any predator. Fear tricks you into believing you have fewer choices than you do. And right now the forest behind me felt like a closed hand. So I stepped forward. The trail swallowed me quickly. 30 feet in, and the clearing behind me was gone. The world replaced by towering trunks that darkened the sky. Every sound, the wind, my breath, even the faint rustle of leaves, felt muffled. It reminded me of walking into a church hours after services had ended. That same heavy quiet. That same pressure in the air. That same sense of being watched by something you couldn't see but could feel deep in your ribs. The farther I walked, the more wrong the forest felt. Trees grew closer together, their roots twisted like knuckles beneath the ground. Some trunks bulged unnaturally, as if something had pressed against the bark from the inside. I passed one that had deep grooves carved into it, long parallel lines that didn't look like claw marks so much as impressions left by fingers. Human fingers. Or something close. My breathing quickened. But the compass needle stayed perfectly aligned, pointing dead ahead. I kept going. The trail bent sharply left, then right, as if weaving through obstacles I couldn't see. The air thickened. The cold deepened. My skin prickled with the sense that distance here didn't work the way it should, that every step carried me farther than the length of my stride. I paused beneath a leaning cedar to adjust my pack and listened. Nothing. The forest was holding its breath again. Then a crunch. My head snapped up. It came from behind me this time. Not far, not close. Footsteps, slow, measured, mirroring my pace from a moment ago. I spun around, heart in my throat. The trail was empty, but the air behind me felt disturbed, like someone had moved through it just seconds earlier. When I turned forward again, the path seemed subtly different, almost imperceptibly shifted to the right. The trees looked rearranged. Maybe it was my nerves. Maybe it was the light. Or maybe the woods were shaping themselves around me as I walked. I tightened my grip on the compass and kept going. The forest opened abruptly into a strange, narrow depression in the earth, an ancient dry creek bed lined with stones smooth as river glass. I hesitated at the edge of it, noticing something carved into the nearest stone. Lines. Not random scratches, not natural erosion. Symbols, etched as if someone had knelt here with a sharp tool and carved them into stone centuries ago. The shapes looked vaguely familiar, like half-remembered letters from a language I didn't know. One symbol repeated on 3 stones, a vertical line with 3 branching marks at the top, almost like a tree, or a figure with arms held wide. My stomach twisted. The compass needle swung sharply, jerking toward the far end of the creek bed. "Of course," I muttered, voice trembling as I followed it. As I walked deeper into the depression, the ground became uneven. Stones shifted under my boots, making me stumble. The canopy above thinned enough to let in a haze of gray light that settled on my skin like dust. Halfway across, I stopped dead. Footprints. Fresh ones. Human-sized. Bare. Toes splayed in the soil. They weren't crisp like mine, not sharply defined. The edges blurred into the earth like the ground had only reluctantly accepted their shape. There were maybe 6 prints, then they vanished abruptly, like whoever made them had stepped forward and dissolved. I crouched, staring at them, dread swelling through me. Something whispered again. Not my name, not words. A low, dragging murmur that sounded like breath pushed through a throat filled with soil. A shiver knifed down my spine. I stalked forward, breath trembling, until I reached the far end of the creek bed. The path narrowed again, forcing me between 2 massive granite boulders coated in dark moss. Just as I squeezed through, the air shifted. Everything went cold, far colder than any natural temperature drop. Frost bloomed along the moss, crackling under my fingertips. The whisper came again, closer, almost conversational, almost amused. I hurried through the gap and emerged into a section of forest unlike anything I'd seen before. The trees were thinner, taller, dead. Their bark peeled away in long strips, revealing gray, desiccated wood beneath. No leaves clung to their branches, no moss grew at their roots. I stepped forward and froze when the ground sank a fraction beneath my boot. Soft, too soft. I knelt down and brushed aside the layer of pine needles. Underneath was not soil, it was fabric, faded, weathered, frayed at the edges. A torn scrap of outerwear, a jacket sleeve, a shade of blue familiar in a way I didn't want to examine. My pulse hammered. I stood quickly, letting the sleeve fall from my fingers. Just ahead, something hung from the branch of a dead tree. At first, I thought it was an animal pelt. Then I realized it was a backpack, shredded, sun-bleached, weather-beaten. The straps dangled like severed limbs. A chill skated across my skin. Someone had been here before me, maybe more than one person. The compass needle vibrated against its glass again, almost frantic now. I lifted it with numb fingers. It pointed toward the center of the dead forest. Not just pointed, pulled. Slowly, as if compelled, I walked toward what the compass wanted me to see. The dead trees parted around a circular clearing, and in the center was a shape. At first, I thought it was a boulder. Then I thought it was a tree stump. Then it moved. Something hunched and massive stirred in the center of the clearing, rising slowly, as if waking from a long sleep. Its limbs were wrong, longer than they should have been, jointed strangely. Its head hung forward, obscured by a curtain of tangled hair or roots or something I didn't recognize. I stumbled backward, heart battering my ribs. The creature, thing, entity turned toward me. Its face was hidden, its posture was hunched, its breath rattled like air forced through broken reeds, and then it spoke. Not loudly, not clearly, but directly. Directly into my skull. My name, not whispered, not breathed, spoken. The sound wasn't external, it vibrated behind my eyes, inside my lungs, in the spaces between my heartbeat. The voice used my name like it had owned it long before I was born. My legs buckled. I hit the ground hard. The creature straightened. Its limbs unfolded in jerking motions, like someone pulling strings attached to a marionette far too big for its stage. Its head tilted, revealing the faint suggestion of a face, something half-formed, half-buried under layers of something pale and tight like stretched bark. I scrambled backward, nearly slipping. The compass needle spun wildly, then stopped, pointing straight at the creature. The voice, its voice, shifted. At first it sounded like mine, then like dozens of voices layered atop one another, then like someone trying on a voice that didn't fit. I pushed myself to my feet, shaking uncontrollably. The creature moved. Not quickly, not slowly. Just inevitably. Every step it took made the ground vibrate faintly, like something deep beneath the forest was answering its movement. I turned to run, and the creature spoke one more time, the sound cracking through my skull like ice breaking underfoot. Don't run, but I did. I ran blindly, crashing through the dead forest, branches tearing at my arms, roots catching my boots. I didn't care. I didn't look back. Behind me, the forest groaned, an ancient low creaking sound, like trees shifting under an immense weight. Like something enormous was waking, or following, or waiting. The whisper chased me, rising in pitch, threading through my ears, my pulse, my breath. It didn't sound like my name anymore. It sounded like a promise, a vow, a claim, and the compass in my hand was no longer pointing ahead. It was pointing behind me, at the thing that wanted me, needed me, was coming for me. I didn't know where I was running. I only knew what I was running from. Branches slashed at my face and arms. Ferns slapped my shins. The forest around me blurred into streaks of gray and brown. Behind me, the whisper, no, the voice, unraveled into something rawer, deeper, guttural. It followed me like breath on my neck. Don't run. The words still ricocheted through my skull, but I kept going, lungs burning, legs shaking beneath me. Every time my foot hit the earth, the ground seemed to pulse, just faintly, as though something beneath the surface felt my movement and pressed upward to meet it. My vision tunneled, my body screamed. But I didn't stop, not until the forest itself forced me to. I broke through a wall of tangled brush and nearly plunged down a sheer drop. I skidded to a halt on loose soil, my boots slipping. The world dropped away in front of me, a cliff at least 40 feet high, its base lost in shadows and thick green undergrowth. A fall would break me. I staggered backward, chest heaving. The woods behind me went silent. Not peaceful silent, held breath silent. My skin went cold. Something was near. Slowly, against every instinct I had, I turned. The forest was still, empty. But it wasn't empty. Not really. The trees closest to me leaned unnaturally forward, their branches bowed like the ribs of some giant animal closing in around a wound. The shadows beneath them swelled as if thickening, taking shape. I couldn't see the creature, but I could feel it. Watching, waiting, listening. My hand drifted down to the compass clipped to my strap. The metal was freezing. It burned my fingertips with cold. The needle was pointing left now, away from the cliff's edge, back toward the dense wall of trees. Not toward safety, toward something, toward it. No, I whispered, shaking my head, throat raw. I'm not following you. The compass needle twitched. Once, twice. Then slowly, violently, it jerked sideways and began to spin again, so fast the sound of metal scraping glass filled the air like a swarm of furious insects. I winced and pulled my hand away, as though the compass itself had become alive and snapping. The needle froze, pointing straight behind me. My breath caught. Behind me was only the cliff, nothing else. I turned my head slowly, scanning the ridge. There, barely visible at first, something rose from the shadows. A shape, a figure, a body that didn't fit together correctly, like someone had assembled it from the memory of a human rather than the truth of one. Its limbs were too long, its shoulders uneven, its posture slumped in a way that suggested there were more joints beneath the skin than should exist. It stood beside a dead tree, one long hand resting on the trunk. The bark beneath its fingers was rotting, discoloring in real time. I stumbled back, heel scraping loose soil along the cliff's edge. The creature tilted its head, not in curiosity, not in confusion, in recognition, as if it already knew me. As if it had been waiting. My pulse throbbed inside my skull. The creature took a step forward. It didn't walk. It didn't stride. It shifted like someone dragging reality forward to meet it. Stop, I rasped, though my voice was barely air. It did. It obeyed. That terrified me more than anything else. I didn't want it near me. I didn't want it listening to my voice. I didn't want it understanding me. But it already did. Its head lowered, hair or roots or bramble-like strands falling forward. Then its mouth, hidden beneath that mess, opened just enough for sound to spill out. Not words, not whispering. Something in between. A mimicry of breathing. A test of shape. A rehearsal. My name followed a moment later. Broken, rearranged, stretched into something abnormal. I choked on my own breath. The thing lifted an arm, pointing one impossibly long finger toward the forest behind it. It wanted me to go there, to follow willingly. No, I said again, but the word left me as a whimper. The creature's head twitched, not tilted, twitched, jerky, wet, like it was learning a new motor function. It stepped closer. My instinct was to run, but there was nowhere to go. Cliff behind me, creature in front of me, trees closing in at the edges. I scanned frantically, looking for anything, any break in the woods, any slope, any path I might have missed. And then I saw it. A narrow crevice in the rock wall to my right, a fissure just barely wide enough for a person to slip through sideways. A way out. A chance. I didn't think. Didn't breathe. I lunged for it. The creature reacted instantly. The ground shook. Branches overhead cracked. A guttural cry, no longer pretending to be human, ripped through the clearing, rattling the dead trees. I dove into the gap in the rock, scraping my shoulders against jagged stone. The space was narrow, suffocating, but I forced myself deeper, chest compressing, lungs flattening. Behind me, something slammed into the cliff wall, hard. Dust rained down. Pebbles clattered around me. A long, thin limb reached into the crevice, feeling blindly, scraping stone, searching for me. I pressed myself deeper into the crack, squeezing through a tight turn until the arm couldn't reach any farther. The creature writhed outside, its frustration vibrating through the rock. Then it went silent. The forest went silent. My own breath was the only sound. I stayed wedged in that crevice for minutes, maybe longer, too afraid to move, too afraid to listen for footsteps that I knew I wouldn't hear anyway. Finally, with my heart still hammering, I squeezed through the remaining gap and emerged onto the other side. The forest around me was dimmer, older, wronger. The air tasted stale, as though it hadn't moved in years. I collapsed onto my knees, gasping, my muscles shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. For a moment, just a moment, I allowed myself the illusion that I'd escaped, that I'd put enough rock between us that the thing had lost interest. Then I heard a sound, not behind me, not above me, below, a slow, deliberate thud, then another, like something walking beneath the ground. My chest tightened. I scrambled away from the crevice, scanning the forest in every direction. My pack threatened to slide off my shoulder. I jerked it back into place. My fingers brushed the compass. I almost didn't look, but I did. The needle wasn't pointing anywhere. It wasn't spinning either. It was bent. The metal warped. The center pin twisted. The glass cracked in two places, as if something had grabbed it, crushed it, while it was still clipped to my chest. A cold jolt traveled through me. It had touched me. Maybe while I slept, maybe while I ran. Maybe when its hands scraped the rock inches from my ribs. I shoved the compass into my pocket. Useless now. There was no path here, no markers, no sound, only the dead forest ahead, sprawling in erratic, unnatural patterns that didn't match any wilderness I'd ever known. I took one step. The ground vibrated again. Soft, distant, footsteps. The creature wasn't behind me anymore. It wasn't following the paths I saw. It was moving through places I couldn't go. Beneath the earth, through the roots, through the dark. A claustrophobic dread filled my lungs, choking me. Then, without warning, the whisper slid back into my bones. But it wasn't calling my name this time. It was humming. A faint broken melody carried through the soil and the roots in the air, vibrating under my knees. A lullaby without words. A call without a voice. And even though the compass was broken, even though the whisper no longer imitated speech, my mind understood it. It was telling me where to go. Deeper, always deeper. Toward the center of whatever had awakened in these woods, because I hadn't escaped anything. I'd only crossed the threshold. Beyond it, the forest wasn't rearranging itself to keep me trapped. It was rearranging itself to bring me where it wanted me. And somewhere below, the creature was moving, slowly, patiently, almost reverently, following my footsteps as if it already knew the ending long before I began. I didn't want to keep moving. Every instinct I had screamed to stay still, hide, vanish inside the trees, and hope the thing beneath the earth forgot about me. But staying still in the wilderness is how you die. Staying still with this thing nearby was worse. So I forced myself upright, wiped the dirt from my palms, and kept going into the dead forest. Each step felt heavier than the last. Not physically, though my legs trembled with fatigue, but emotionally. like the air itself was thickening around me, dragging at my joints, trying to slow me down. The trees leaned close, their skeletal branches clacking overhead with faint, brittle tapping sounds. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like something was sending a message through the wood. I didn't look up. I couldn't. Ahead, the forest sloped downward into a series of shallow ridges. The ground beneath my boots felt different than before, less like soil, more like something hollowed out beneath the surface. Occasionally, my footsteps sent faint vibrations spreading outward, as though the earth were listening. The humming whisper continued underneath it all, a sound I couldn't shake, a sound that didn't need my ears to enter me, a sound too close to thought. My breath fogged the air, even though the temperature hadn't dropped enough for that. Cold radiated upward from the ground, seeping through the soles of my boots. At one point, I stopped and crouched down, pressing my fingertips to the dirt. It felt like ice, and something else. Faint movement. Not seismic, not animal, like roots shifting, repositioning, making room. There were no leaves, no birds, not even insects. The forest was utterly, impossibly dead, except for the thing moving beneath it, the thing that knew my name. I stood, my breath trembling, and continued. The world narrowed to the pathless woods and the sound of my heartbeat. I climbed over fallen trunks, damp with rot, and ducked beneath low branches that snagged at my jacket like grasping fingers. The dead forest gradually gave way to a different terrain, older, darker, with trees that seemed petrified rather than dead. Their bark looked like stone, their roots jutted from the ground in jagged ridges, their branches curled like claws against the sky. For a moment I stopped, just stared. Because far ahead, barely visible through the trunks, something glowed. Not brightly, not naturally. A faint, pale luminescence pulsed in the air like breath made visible. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, moving gently as though the light wasn't stationary, but alive. A cold weight settled in my stomach. That light was what the creature wanted me to reach. I knew it. Every instinct screamed it. But the humming beneath the ground only grew stronger the closer I got to it. The forest was vibrating now, roots shifting, trunks creaking, branches groaning like old bones. The humming moved with me, following each step like a shadow that traveled through the soil. I couldn't turn back. There was no back anymore, only deeper, always deeper. I descended into a narrow gorge, the walls of stone slick with moisture. The air grew colder still, forming faint wisps of mist that curled around my ankles. The sound beneath the earth grew louder, no longer just humming but breathing, slow, heavy, wet, as though the ground itself inhaled and exhaled beneath me. I pressed forward, teeth clenched, hands shaking from both cold and dread. My fingers brushed the rock wall beside me, feeling the texture, cool, rough, oddly sticky in places. When I pulled my hand away, something like fine dust clung to my skin. No, not dust. Ash. My chest tightened. Something had burned here long ago, something big, something old. At the far end of the gorge, the ground opened into a cavern-like clearing, an oval hollow whose floor dipped slightly toward the center. And there it was, the light, a faint glow rising from a cluster of twisted, bleached branches arranged in a tangled spiral formation. They grew from the ground itself, forming a circle around a depression filled with something dark. I stepped closer. The ground trembled faintly beneath my feet. The air thickened. My vision blurred. Then I realized what I was seeing. Bones, not branches. Bones arranged like roots, interwoven, knotted, grown upward from the dirt like the forest itself had sprouted skeletal limbs instead of wood. My breath caught in my throat. Human bones. Animal bones. Bones I couldn't identify, all fused together into a single structure. A shrine? A nest? A trap? I didn't know, but the light pulsed from within the circle of bone roots, illuminating the clearing with a sickly, pale glow. I forced myself a step closer. The dark pit inside the bone circle writhed. At first I thought it was water, then mud, then something alive. It shifted slowly, bubbling, breathing. A low groan rose from it, then a whisper. Not words, not a voice. Something deeper, something older, something hungry. I stumbled backward, but not before the ground beneath my feet pulsed violently. Not shaking, pulsing, like a heartbeat, like something beneath the earth had placed its palm against the underside of the ground and pushed upward. The roots around the clearing trembled, the bone structure creaked, and then the whisper returned. This time not above, not behind, not within the earth. It came from directly across the clearing. I turned. Something was standing between the trees on the far side. Not the creature from before. Something smaller, bent, human-shaped. I squinted, my stomach clenching, my breath frozen. It looked like a person, a real person, a hiker maybe, clothes tattered, hair long, matted, skin pale and stretched tight across sharp bones. He, or it, stood motionless, head tilted too far to one side. Then it stepped forward. The movement was wrong, too light, too smooth, too synchronized with the pulse of the ground. The figure opened its mouth, and the whisper came out. Not from its throat, from the forest, through it, like it was a vessel, a mouthpiece, a puppet with air forced through lungs that no longer worked. It took another step. I stumbled back, heart crashing in my chest, my foot caught on a root. I almost fell into the bone circle. The puppet mimic tilted its head the other way, slowly, mechanically. Then its jaw unhinged. The skin around its mouth tore. Its eyes rolled upward. A deep, gurgling exhale rattled from its chest, and the whisper surged through it, so loud it made my ears ring and my vision shake. My knees gave out. I hit the ground hard, palms scraping rock. The puppet mimic dragged itself forward with jerking, unnatural steps, each movement cracking joints that didn't bend the right way. The bone circle behind me throbbed with light. The ground beneath me pulsed. The whisper grew louder, layered, multi-voiced, filled with a kind of hunger I'd never imagined possible. The mimic opened its ruined mouth wider, too wide, and from deep in its throat, far deeper than any human throat could allow, something moved, something trying to speak, trying to escape, trying to reach me. The ground convulsed, the bones rattled, the whisper crescendoed, and something beneath the forest began to rise. Not the mimic, not the creature, something bigger, something that had waited a long, long time. And the forest was happy. It wanted me there. It had brought me here. All the shifting trees, the rearranged ridges, the broken compass, the dead forest leading inward. It had all been a funnel, a throat, a pathway, and I was standing at the center of it. The mimic lunged. The ground cracked. The whisper erupted, and the thing beneath the earth began to surface. The ground didn't just tremble. It buckled. A deep shudder rippled through the earth, rolling beneath me like something massive shifting in its sleep. Pebbles danced, dust plumed upward. The bone circle behind me rattled so violently the fused ribs clacked together like teeth. The mimic lunged again, its limbs jerking as though pulled by strings from beneath the soil. I scrambled backward on hands and elbows, my breath a desperate rasp in my throat. "Stay back," I whispered. It didn't matter. The puppet didn't hear me. It wasn't meant to. The whisper that filled its torn mouth wasn't coming from lungs or vocal cords or even a mind. It was being pushed through it, like something ancient was learning to speak by practicing on the hollowed remains of a human body. As it crawled toward me, the ground beneath us convulsed again. A crack tore through the dirt near the bone circle. Not a small one. This was the kind of fracture that split the forest floor like a wound opening. A deep, resonant groan rose up from under the earth. Roots snapped. Soil poured downward. Air rushed past my face, sucked toward the widening gap. The thing beneath the surface was rising. The mimic jerked violently, thrown sideways as the ground pitched, its head twisted mid-fall, rotating too far, snapping something deep inside its neck. It hit the ground in a crumpled heap but kept moving, dragged forward by the whisper itself. I pushed myself to my feet. The bone circle's glow intensified. The light pulsed faster, stronger. The bones creaked as though under strain. Cracks crawled across them. One by one, the skeletal branches forming the circle began to shake, like something from below was pushing upward, bending them outward. The pit inside churned violently, the dark mass bubbling and heaving like mud boiling over fire. But it wasn't mud. It was flesh, shifting, coiling, rearranging itself. Not an animal, not a creature. a presence given form only by need. The crack in the ground widened, the hum deepened, the whisper turned into a low, resonant rumble that shook my bones. I staggered backward until my back hit a tree. Its bark felt warm through my jacket, too warm. Something pulsed inside it, something alive, something listening. I forced myself to move away, stumbling to the side as another quake rippled through the clearing. The mimic clawed at the dirt, its broken limbs scraping grooves in the soil. Its mouth opened wider, skin tearing at the corners, trying to form words that weren't meant for human tongues. The whisper surged out of it, louder than before. My name, twisted, echoing, layered with dozens of other tones that didn't belong to it. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't entering through my ears anymore. It filled my chest, pressed into my ribs, vibrated in my throat. My vision flickered. I stumbled again, nearly falling into the widening crack. When I caught myself, my hand brushed something half buried in the dirt. I pulled it free without thinking and froze. Another compass, old, rust-eaten, glass shattered, a split strap still clung to it. Someone else had stood here. Someone else had been brought here. Someone else had dropped this when the forest took them. My breath stuttered. The ground roared beneath me. The bone circle split. Bones cracked like brittle branches as something pushed upward through the pit. At first it looked like a cluster of thick roots rising, intertwined with a dark substance below. Then I saw the textures beneath the filth. Smooth, glassy, pale, not roots. Fingers. A full hand emerged. Too large, too long, its joints bending wrong. Flesh clung to it in patches, fused with roots, as though it had grown inside the forest itself. The thing's palm pressed against the rim of the circle. The bones strained, bending outward. The mimic reached it first. It crawled directly to the hand, mouth opening in reverence, head bowing as though greeting something holy. Then the hand moved. It snapped upward, grabbing the mimic's face in an impossibly fast motion. There was no scream, just a wet, instant collapse. The puppet's skull crushed like rotten fruit. Its limbs spasmed once, twice, and then went still. The whisper vanished from its body, returned to the ground. Returned to the bones, returned to the rising thing. I backed away so fast I tripped and fell. Dirt coated my palms. Rocks bit into my skin. I didn't get up. I couldn't. My muscles locked, paralyzed by terror. The hand flexed, pulling more of its body upward. A second hand gripped the opposite edge of the pit. Then a head rose, shrouded in tangled hair, dripping with soil and sap and something darker. Beneath the hair, glimpses of skin stretched too tight over bone. The face was wrong, like something had tried to carve a human shape from stone and bark and memory. The eyes opened. They weren't eyes. They were fissures, thin, glowing slits that pulsed faintly with the same pale light as the bone circle. They locked onto me. My breath hitched so violently I choked. The whisper returned, but now it wasn't just in my chest. It was in my bones. Every part of me vibrated with the resonance of that voice, as though it knew my shape from the inside. As though it had been inside me my whole life, waiting for my body to cross its threshold. My legs gave out. I collapsed fully, palms digging into the cold soil. The creature entity rose higher, shoulders forming beneath its root-laced skin. The ground around the pit bulged as more of it surfaced. It wasn't a body. It wasn't a creature. It was the forest. The earth was giving shape to something that didn't belong above ground. The whisper, its voice, deepened into something that reverberated through the clearing. Not a word. Not my name. Something older. A call. A summons. An invitation. Something answered it. Not far away, a tree behind me cracked loudly, splitting at its base. Another groan echoed from deeper in the forest. Branches swayed violently, though there was no wind. Roots rippled beneath the soil like serpents. The forest was waking. Everything in it was moving toward me. I forced myself up, crawling, stumbling, barely able to function, and sprinted toward the edge of the clearing, but the roots rose to stop me. They burst from the ground like skeletal fingers, curling around my boots, dragging me downward. I kicked and tore at them, panic feeding strength I didn't know I had. A root wrapped around my ankle like a rope. I screamed. Raw, primal, kicking until the sharp wood tore free of the soil. I didn't stop running, not even when something thundered behind me, huge, heavy footsteps that made the forest floor quake. Not even when the whisper grew louder, filling my skull with unbearable pressure. Run, run, run. My legs pumped harder than they ever had in my life, carrying me between blackened trunks and over gnarled roots. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from that clearing, away from the thing rising from it. But the forest didn't want to let me go. Branches swung inward like arms trying to grab me. Roots shifted underfoot, trees leaned. The path twisted back toward the thing. I pushed harder, lungs burning, vision swimming. My foot caught on a root. I fell, slamming into the ground. The whisper hit me like a physical force, a single command, come back. I clawed at the dirt, pulling myself forward despite the pain. My nails tore. My fingers bled. The forest groaned behind me, shaking with each step the thing took. I dragged myself across the ground until my hand landed on something metal, cold, hard, familiar, a compass. My compass, the one that had been crushed, warped, ruined. But now the needle moved. It trembled, twitched, quivered toward a direction, away from the clearing, away from the voice, away from the rising thing. This time it didn't spin, didn't break, didn't lock onto the whisper. It pointed back toward the living forest, the real forest. I didn't think, I grabbed it. And I ran where it told me to run. Not toward the voice, not toward the thing, but away from it. For the first time since entering this nightmare, the compass wasn't guiding me deeper. It was guiding me out. Behind me, something vast roared through the trees, something that had never meant for me to escape, something that was waking fully, something ancient, something hungry. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I knew I wouldn't be able to look away. And I had only one chance left before the forest closed its throat around me for good. The compass needle shook in my palm like it was afraid. I didn't question it. I didn't think. I just ran. The forest whipped past me in streaks of black and gray. Branches clawed at my jacket, ripping fabric, scraping skin. My lungs screamed for air. My legs felt like wet sand. Every heartbeat was a hammer blow. Behind me, the forest roared. Not wind, not thunder. Something alive. Something massive pushing through the trees, bending them sideways, cracking trunks in half like matchsticks. The earth shook with every step it took. Bark rained from the canopy. Leaves tore from branches and spiraled around me like a storm. I didn't dare look back, not even once. The compass needle trembled harder, jerking in tiny spasms toward a direction that looked like nothing but deeper woods. But I trusted it, because for the first time it wasn't pointing toward the voice. It was pointing away. Run. I pushed myself harder. The ground vibrated beneath my boots, slow pulses at first, then faster. Closer. Like something enormous was matching my stride from beneath the soil. A root burst from the earth, inches from my foot. I leapt over it, stumbling but recovering. Another root whipped upward, slashing through the air like a striking snake. It missed my leg by inches. The forest wasn't trying to confuse me anymore. It was trying to stop me. A tree to my left groaned loudly, then toppled with a crash so powerful the ground rippled beneath me. I veered right, ducking under splintering branches as the trunk slammed into the earth behind me, spraying dirt and shattered bark. I kept going. The compass needle flicked left. I followed. It flicked right. I obeyed. The forest bent itself around my path, branches arching overhead to block moonlight, dead trunks leaning inward like ribs closing around a lung. But the compass fought the pull of the woods, dragging me toward a direction that felt wrong and right at the same time. My breath tore in and out of my chest. The whisper rose behind me, no longer a murmur but a scream. Not a single voice, but dozens, hundreds, all layered, distorted, echoing through the trunks. My name, my name, my name. Over and over until the sound wasn't language anymore. It was pressure, a force that made my vision flicker at the edges. I clamped my hands over my ears. It didn't matter. The sound wasn't entering from the outside. It was inside my teeth, inside my bones, inside my heartbeat. The ground convulsed again, so violently this time that I pitched forward and slammed onto my hands. Pain shot through my wrists. I pushed myself up, gasping. Another crack split the earth to my right, wide enough to swallow a person whole. For a moment, something moved inside it, a pale limb, a tangle of hair, a glimpse of glowing fisher eyes. I screamed and sprinted in the opposite direction. The compass needle quivered in my hand, pointing toward a faint break in the trees ahead. Barely visible, just a sliver of lighter darkness. I headed for it. Branches whipped across my face. My legs were shaking so violently I barely felt the ground. The roar behind me grew louder, rising into a guttural, bone-shaking bellow that sounded like centuries of hunger collapsing into a single sound. I burst from the dead forest into a slightly more open stretch, where the trees weren't petrified but alive again, green and trembling in the unnatural wind. The air tasted different, fresher, real. The compass needle steadied. It pointed straight ahead, sharp and decisive. I ran until my vision blurred into streaks. The forest thinned. Roots stopped rising to trip me. The ground stopped pulsing. Then the whisper stopped. Not faded. Stopped. Cut off as abruptly as a severed cord. The sudden silence hit so hard I staggered to a halt, chest heaving. I whipped around, expecting to see the creature right behind me, expecting glowing fissure eyes inches from my face. But the trees behind me were still. Too still. Not calm. Watching. Waiting. I took one stumbling step backward. The moment my boot touched the soil outside the dead forest, a deep, resonant groan rippled through the roots behind me. A line formed in the earth, then another, then another. The ground split open along a jagged seam, like a mouth silently closing. A final warning. Or a final promise. I didn't stay to find out. I turned and ran. The forest around me blurred into living greens and browns. The sky overhead opened into patchwork gray. My breaths came in sharp, ragged bursts. My body burned with fatigue so deep I felt hollow, but I kept going. I didn't stop until I slammed shoulder first into something wooden. A post. I staggered back, blinking. A trail marker. Faded, weathered, but real. My legs nearly gave out with relief. I braced myself against it, sucking in deep breaths. I was out. I was out. But the thought felt fragile, like saying it too loudly would draw something through the trees. I followed the marker, stumbling down a slope that led into a familiar ravine. The damp smell of moss and cedar washed over me. The world felt real again. Grounded. I could hear birds. Birds. I nearly cried. When I reached the bottom of the ravine, sunlight filtered through the canopy in weak, fractured beams. I could see the trail I'd taken the morning I arrived. The real trail. The compass needle pointed toward it, not toward the dead forest, not toward the whisper. Forward. I climbed out of the ravine on trembling legs, every step weaker than the last. When I reached the ridge where I'd camped my first night, the tent was still there, but the clearing looked different again. Normal. The trees were where they should be. The fallen log was at its original angle. My sleeping bag lay spilled out of the tent flap like I'd left it in a rush. None of it looked touched. None of it looked disturbed. But the dirt near the fire pit told a different story. Small, repeated depressions circled the clearing. Not boot prints. Not animal tracks. Finger marks. Dozens. Hundreds. Pressed deep into the soil. I couldn't breathe. I backed away from the clearing so fast I nearly lost my footing, then turned and ran down the trail toward the distant parking lot. It felt like hours. Maybe it was. But eventually, after more stumbling than actual running, I saw the glint of metal through the trees. My car. In the same spot. Untouched. Waiting. When I reached it, I fumbled the keys 3 times before getting the door open. I collapsed into the driver's seat, shaking uncontrollably. The interior smelled stale and warm. Normal. Safe. I turned the engine over. It started on the first try. I pulled out of that trailhead so fast I nearly clipped the sign at the entrance. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. Not until I reached the highway miles later. When I finally lifted my eyes to the mirror, just to be sure nothing followed me out of those woods, the compass in my pocket vibrated. I froze. The vibration grew stronger. I pulled with trembling fingers. The needle was spinning, slowly, methodically. Then it stopped, pointing behind me, toward the forest. toward the voice. My stomach dropped. I looked back at the mirror. The trees lining the distant trail had swayed in the wind, but the wind wasn't blowing. Not there. Not yet. I dropped the compass onto the passenger seat. It trembled once more. Then the needle jerked violently, pointing sideways toward the window, toward the empty road slicing through the desert forest, toward nothing, toward something. A cold, crawling dread spread through my ribs. It wasn't pointing back to the forest anymore. It was pointing toward the horizon, following something, tracking something, something that wasn't me, something that had left the woods, something that was moving, and it was heading in the same direction I was driving. My hands tightened around the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. I pressed my foot harder on the gas. The compass needle moved again, slowly, deliberately. It followed something I couldn't see, something walking parallel to the highway, something matching my speed. Then the whisper returned, soft, faint, so quiet I almost thought it was memory. But it wasn't behind me, it wasn't ahead, it was beside the car, pacing me, close enough that I felt the vibration of it against the glass. My name, drawn out, fragile, patient. Like it had all the time in the world. The compass rolled off the seat and onto the floor. I didn't pick it up. I didn't slow down. I didn't look to the right, even when the faint shadow slid across the roadside trees, too tall to be human, too thin to cast a real shape. I didn't look. I couldn't, because I knew, if I did, I would see eyes reflecting back at me from the tree line. Two pale fissures glowing faintly in the darkness, watching, waiting, learning the shape of the world outside the forest, learning me. And I don't know when it will find me, only that it wasn't finished, only that it followed, and only that, somewhere out there in the moving dark between the trees and the road, the woods are still calling my name. I always thought of the mountains as a place of absolution, a world untouched by the chaos of our daily lives. That's why, after weeks of endless office hours and city noise, I packed my old backpack, double-checked my gear, and set out for the High Ridge Wilderness, a stretch of rugged peaks and dense forest tucked away in the northern state line. There was no cell service there, something that felt more like liberation than a nuisance. Just me, the trail, and the quiet. The first day was deceptively easy. The trailhead started at the edge of a small parking lot where a faded sign warned of wildlife and hazardous terrain. I laughed at the dramatic wording. The only wildlife I saw were squirrels darting between trees and a lone hawk circling overhead. The forest was alive, but in a comforting way, birds calling in patterns I didn't recognize, the wind teasing the branches, and the scent of pine so thick it clung to my clothes. I moved with purpose, occasionally stopping to take notes on my handheld recorder. I liked to capture the ambient sounds, believing that the subtle rustling of the leaves and distant bird calls would make my memory of the trip richer. Around mid-afternoon, I found a small clearing beside a rocky outcrop and decided to rest. From there, I could see the next ridge, shadowed in the deep green of spruce and fir, stretching as far as the eye could reach. That's when I heard it for the first time. A howl, low and distant, rolled over the ridges. At first, I assumed it was a coyote, wild, but normal. I even laughed softly, raising my recorder to catch the sound. The howl stretched and trembled through the valley, fading only to be swallowed by the forest. But there was something strange about it. The pitch wavered unnaturally, rising and falling in a rhythm that almost mimicked human intonation. I shrugged it off, blaming the acoustics of the canyon. Night fell sooner than I expected. The shadows between the trees deepened, and the wind picked up. I found a small spot near a creek, cleared a patch for my sleeping bag, and made a fire. Sparks danced like restless spirits before fading into the darkness. I recorded again, capturing the gurgle of the water and the crackle of flames. Then, faintly at first, I heard it again. A howl from somewhere deeper in the forest. I froze. The sound seemed closer, more deliberate, almost as if someone or something was standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, listening. I strained my eyes, trying to pierce the blackness between the trees. Nothing moved, but the hairs on my neck were standing on end. I told myself it was nothing. Wolves or coyotes were normal here. My imagination had a way of twisting things at night. Still, I felt a twitch of unease and kept my recorder on, hoping to capture the sound for playback in the morning. I slept fitfully, waking at intervals to the snap of twigs or the low rustle of leaves. Each time, I convinced myself it was the forest settling around me, but the memory of that howl lingered, a thread of unease I couldn't shake. Morning came with mist curling around the trees, soft and white, settling into the valleys like smoke. I packed quickly, my stomach uneasy. There was an energy in the forest that didn't exist in the daylight of my city life, a tension that made the branches creak like old bones and the shadows beneath the ferns look like hollowed faces. By late morning, I reached a ridge that promised a panoramic view. I stopped, pressed record on my camera, and panned the landscape. The wind whistled through the peaks, carrying with it a faint echo of something. I paused, my hand trembling slightly. There it was again, the howl. This time, unmistakably distinct. I could swear it carried a pattern, a cadence that felt almost like words stretched over the mountains, though I couldn't understand them. I shook my head. It was the wind, I told myself. Just the wind. The rest of the hike was quiet, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. By late afternoon, I found a suitable campsite near an old stand of trees. A fallen log became my bench. The creek babbled nearby, its water cool and clear. I made dinner over a small stove and double-checked my recordings from the morning. The howl was faint, but it was there. Curiosity, as much as fear, made me play it back. I held the small speaker close and listened. At first, it was the distant echo I had heard, a wolf-like sound stretching over the valleys. But as the playback continued, my stomach turned cold. The pitch was shifting, subtly, almost imperceptibly, until it took on a timbre that sounded eerily human. I froze. My own voice seemed to emerge from the speaker, slurred and broken, calling my name. "Help me," it whispered, or at least that's what my mind interpreted. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the recorder. The forest went silent, as if it had swallowed my panic whole. No birds, no rustling leaves, no creak. Only the residual echo of my own voice lingering in the mist. I stepped away from the speaker, my heart hammering. I told myself it was a trick of the playback, some artifact of the recording. Rational thought. Logic. I repeated it like a mantra, trying to convince myself. But even as I lay down later, my sleep was haunted by the echo, the sensation that something was moving through the trees, mimicking me, learning me. By midnight, the wind had died, and the forest was unnervingly still. I wanted to convince myself I was safe inside my tent, cocooned from the wilderness, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the distant drip of water, felt amplified. And beneath it all, faintly, the howl returned, stretched and warped, carrying a voice I recognized far too well. I whispered to myself, trying to drown it out, "It's nothing, just the wind, just the wind." But even as I spoke, my words felt hollow, echoed back at me from the shadows. End of part 1. Continue in part 2. The morning light brought little comfort. The forest looked ordinary enough, tall evergreens, scattered ferns, patches of moss. But the memory of the night's howl clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I packed my gear in silence, avoiding the recorder this time. Somehow, the thought of hearing my own voice echoing through the mountains again was unbearable. As I climbed higher, the trail narrowed and became less distinct. Loose stones slid under my boots, and roots twisted like gnarled fingers across the path. The wind picked up again, whispering through the trees in an almost conversational tone. Every time it gusted, I felt as though the forest itself was watching, holding its breath. Around midday, I reached a small plateau overlooking a valley. I paused to rest, and that's when I noticed the first oddity. Footprints. Human-shaped, fresh enough that the soil hadn't dried around them completely. But there was only one trail, leading away from the main path and deeper into the forest. No other signs of human presence, no litter, no campsite remains, just these solitary prints. A shiver ran down my spine. I crouched to examine them, comparing them to my own boots. They weren't mine, too large and the stride too uneven. My first instinct was to follow them, to see who or what had been here. But the rational part of me screamed to turn back. I marked the spot mentally, then moved on, my pace quickening. The forest thickened, and shadows pooled under the trees. Birds had vanished, and even the wind seemed cautious, hesitating at the treetops. I tried to stay focused on the trail, but the sense of being observed intensified. Every rustle of leaves or snapping twig made me jump. I began to record small notes on my phone, mostly to reassure myself that I was documenting something real, something tangible, rather than losing my mind. By late afternoon, the trail forked into two barely distinguishable paths. I hesitated, debating which to take. My instincts told me to stick to the right, which looked more traveled, but my curiosity drew me left, where the earth was softer, the canopy thicker. Against better judgment, I took the left path. Almost immediately, the temperature dropped, and a damp fog began to settle into the valley. I had been walking for nearly an hour when I noticed something else: the trees. They were twisted in ways that didn't make sense, some leaning at impossible angles, their bark scarred with deep grooves. At first, I thought it was old damage, weather, wildlife, but the marks seemed deliberate. Carvings, strange symbols, almost runic, etched into the trunks at eye level. My pulse quickened. Whoever or whatever had been here had left a trail, and the symbols felt like a warning. I snapped a few photos, but even through the lens, the carvings seemed to shift, like they weren't fully there, or like they were watching. I shoved the camera back into my pack, telling myself I was imagining things. As I continued, an unnatural silence fell over the trail. The wind had died completely, and not a bird or insect stirred. The forest felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. Then, faintly, I heard it again, the howl. But this time it wasn't distant, it was near, very near, and carried that terrible familiarity. I froze. The sound was warped, hollow, stretching in pitch, and then it happened. A single word emerged, distinct in the echoing air. My name. Help. I dropped my pack in shock, my hands trembling. There was no one there, just trees, mist, and shadows. Yet the voice, unmistakably mine, called again, louder this time, closer, almost right behind me. I spun around, searching, heart pounding. Nothing. Only the trail ahead, disappearing into a wall of fog. I ran. My boots pounded against roots and stones as I barreled through the forest, branches scratching my arms, fog wrapping around me like icy fingers. I didn't dare look back, but the sound followed. Soft at first, then louder, my own voice straining in the fog, crying for help, echoing in a way that was impossible. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing. A broken tree lay across the center, its limbs sprawled like skeletal arms. I leaned against it, gasping, trying to convince myself it was a hallucination. My recorder had fallen during the run, and when I picked it up, my stomach sank. Playback automatically started, the howl again, twisting and warping, and beneath it, unmistakably, my voice. I pressed stop and stared at the recorder, hands shaking. The voice on the playback didn't match what I remembered saying before. It was slurred, distorted, like it had been dragged through water, and yet the words were clear. My name, pleading, fractured, terrifyingly real. I had to get out of the forest. That much I knew. But the trail back was gone, or maybe it never existed. Every direction looked the same, dense trees, fog, shadows. I tried calling out, my own voice trembling. Hello? Anyone? For a moment, silence. Then, the howl. But now, it wasn't coming from a distance. It was everywhere, surrounding me, and layered beneath it impossibly my own voice again, pleading, desperate. Panic surged through me. I turned to run, but something caught my foot. A root, a stone, something, and I fell hard. Pain shot through my ankle, sharp and immediate. I scrambled to sit up, pressing a hand against the mud, and that's when I noticed it. Footprints. More of them. Surrounding the clearing, leading nowhere, circling me in a perfect, unnatural pattern. They weren't human. Too large, too uneven, too precise. My heart hammered. The fog thickened, curling around my legs, around the clearing, until the trees seemed to lean closer, shadows pooling at the edge of my vision. And then, from the mist, The sound came again, the howl that repeated my voice, louder, clearer, terrifyingly intimate. I realized in a sudden gut-wrenching clarity that it wasn't just mimicking me, it knew me. It was learning me, listening, waiting. And I was trapped. I didn't sleep that night. I tried. I swear I tried. But every time I closed my eyes, the mist in that clearing returned. I could see the shadows of trees leaning in, hear the faint rustle of leaves that weren't moving, and beneath it all, faintly, agonizingly, my own voice calling for help, coming from somewhere beyond the edges of my consciousness. By first light, I knew I had to move. My ankle throbbed, but staying still was worse. I grabbed my pack, tested the leg, and limped into the fog. The trail I had followed the previous day was gone, erased as if it had never existed. Every direction looked identical, dense, dark evergreens, mist pooling around gnarled roots. I tried to rely on instinct. I walked north, then west, circling and doubling back, trying to keep my bearings. My food supply was minimal, but I barely noticed. Hunger was overshadowed by the gnawing terror pressing at my chest. And every so often that sound returned, the howl, closer than before, mocking me. Then I noticed the signs. First, small things. My water bottle, which I was certain I had stowed securely in my pack, lying beside a mossy boulder. My gloves, missing from the top of the pack, draped over a low branch. My recorder, battery dead, despite having charged it fully the night before, sitting at the edge of a creek like it had been placed there deliberately. And then larger things. Footprints. Too many, too perfectly spaced, leading deeper into the fog. Some human-shaped, some grotesquely elongated and distorted. Every step I took seemed to be anticipated, as if the forest itself was rearranging itself to follow me, to herd me. I called out, voice trembling. "Is anyone there? Please, I'm hurt," the forest answered. Not with another howl, not with a rustle of leaves, but with my own voice. From somewhere just beyond the mist, I heard it, fragmented, pleading. "Help me." I stumbled back, nearly falling into a shallow ditch. The voice changed then, rising in pitch, warping in strange patterns until it sounded angry, possessive. Like it wanted me to follow it, like it wanted me to know I was being hunted. I ran, limping and flailing through the fog, branches tearing at my jacket. Every so often, I glimpsed shapes moving in the mist, shapes that shouldn't exist. Not quite human, not quite animal, watching, waiting. And every time I paused to catch my breath, the sound returned, now layered with whispers, laughter, cries, all mine, all echoing from different directions, impossible to locate. Hours, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning, passed. I stumbled into a small clearing, knees bleeding from the rocks and roots. The fog here was thick, almost suffocating. And then I saw it, the remnants of another campsite. Charred logs, tattered tent fabric, empty cans, a backpack torn open, everything scattered. And there, carved into a tree facing the clearing, a symbol I recognized from the previous day. But this time it wasn't alone. Hundreds of scratchings, circling the tree like some ritual, each one deeper, sharper, more deliberate than the last. And in the center, a message. It was my handwriting. I knew it because I had written it in my journal earlier that morning. Help me. I'm lost. My stomach turned. My own voice, my own writing, used against me. The forest wasn't just mimicking me anymore. It was learning me, copying me, twisting me. I tried to escape, limping west, following what I hoped was the trail back. But the forest had changed. Every landmark I recognized, the bend in the creek, the jagged rock outcrop, the old fallen tree, was gone, replaced with new shadows, new shapes. My mind started to fracture. I called out again, desperate, "Who's there?" The howl answered. It was louder, closer, circling, and then, clear as day, my own voice, "Come, back." I froze. The fog swirled around me, thickening, and the shadows lengthened unnaturally. And then I saw it briefly in the mist, a figure, not quite human. It moved like me, limping slightly, the same pack, the same jacket, the same face blurred in shadow, and it was following me. Panic overtook reason. I ran blindly, branches whipping my face, roots catching my boots. The forest became a labyrinth, reshaping itself with every step. I could no longer hear birds, wind, or even the creek, only the howl, only my voice, calling me, guiding me, trapping me. Hours, or maybe seconds later, I collapsed at the base of a massive tree, my chest heaving, vision blurred. The mist was still, heavy, like a living wall pressing in, and then I heard it, not a howl this time, but laughter. My laughter. My voice twisted into something cruel and hollow, echoing all around me. I tried to stand, I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure in the fog approached, slowing now, deliberate, and then it spoke. Not in words I could fully understand, but in a cadence so familiar it made my blood run cold, my own voice. Distorted, pleading, angry, alive. It was waiting for me. And I knew, with a certainty that left no room for hope, that the forest was no longer just around me. It was me. I woke gasping, my body pressed against damp earth, branches scratching across my arms. The fog had thinned slightly, but the forest felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. Every shadow seemed to twitch at the edge of my vision, every rustle in the underbrush a whispered warning. My recorder, still clutched in one hand, was now dead, its display blank, though the last playback haunted me like a pulse in my chest. I tried to move. My ankle throbbed violently, and each step sent stabbing pain through my leg. But the need to get out overpowered the pain. I limped forward, deeper into the forest, though I had no idea which direction led out. Then the howl returned, closer, louder, layered with my own voice, stretched and warped into something monstrous. But this time it carried something new, urgency. A cadence that wasn't just mimicking me, it was commanding me, guiding me somewhere. And beneath it all, I swore I heard whispers. Not words, not sentences, just my name repeated over and over, rising in pitch until it felt like the air itself was screaming it. I stumbled into a clearing. Moonlight, weak and fractured by mist, revealed a strange sight. Trees had been bent, twisted, forming shapes that resembled cages. Branches arched unnaturally, their tips entwined like fingers ready to grab. And in the center, a figure. It looked human at first, my height, my build, but the closer I got, the more I realized it wasn't. Its movements mirrored mine, but jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being forced along strings. Its face was shadowed, yet I could see my own features reflected there. The lines of my jaw, the hollow under my eyes, the way I squinted when I was tired. And then it spoke. "Why did you come?" It was my voice, my words, but wrong. Wrong in tone, wrong in intention. There was menace behind it, a hunger I could feel pressing into my chest. I stumbled backward, heart hammering. What are you?" I croaked. The figure tilted its head, the fog swirling around it, absorbing light. "I am you," it said, "and I am hungry." The forest seemed to close in. The twisted trees moved imperceptibly, shadows stretching to block any escape. The mist thickened, curling around my legs like icy hands. And the howl, my own voice, echoed again, now coming from every direction. It wasn't just a sound. It was intent. It was the forest itself, shaping me, copying me, drawing me into its trap. I turned to run, stumbling blindly over roots and rocks. My ankle gave out, and I fell hard, scraping my hands against rough bark. Pain shot up my leg, but worse than the pain was the certainty that I couldn't escape. Every path looked the same, twisted and rearranged by some intelligence I couldn't comprehend. And then I heard it, soft, almost gentle, but unmistakable. "Here, come to me." It was my voice, whispering from a cluster of trees to my left. I spun toward it, trembling, and glimpsed movement. Shadows parted, revealing a trail of footprints in the moss. They were my own. I didn't remember leaving them. And behind them, the figure followed, silent now, waiting. I had to make a choice. Follow the trail and risk whatever was ahead, or try to break away and risk being hunted by the forest itself. My survival instinct won. I limped along the trail, the fog curling around me like living smoke, the howl shifting with each step. I reached another clearing, this one smaller, almost circular. The mist hung heavy, and in the center was a rock, slick with moisture, and on it, my recorder. It wasn't mine, or at least not the one I had brought. It played a sound automatically, the howl again, but this time slower, deliberate, closer, and under it, clear as day, my voice calling for help. "Help me," it said. I couldn't resist. I pressed play. The sound filled the clearing, echoed off the twisted trees. my own voice warped, pleading, repeating endlessly. And then I noticed movement in the mist. Figures, hundreds of them, emerging like wraiths from the fog, all human-shaped, all mimicking me in subtle ways, my posture, my gestures, my limping step. I tried to scream, tried to run, but the forest seemed to pull at me, roots snaking around my legs, the mist thickening into a choking cloud. My own voice called out again, louder, angrier, everywhere at once. The figures moved closer, and one stepped forward, the original, the one that had mirrored me perfectly. Its shadowed face leaned in, and I saw my own eyes staring back at me. "You shouldn't have come," it said, my voice trembling in terror. "Now you're mine." I struggled, kicking and punching at the mist, at the shadow, at anything. But it was futile. The forest pressed in from all sides, the howl filling my head, a choir of my own voice screaming, crying, begging. Pain, fear, and vertigo mixed until I lost all sense of reality. And then, in a moment of clarity that I didn't understand, I realized what it wanted. Not just my fear, not just my voice, but my identity, my life. It was learning me, consuming me, shaping me into something it could call its own. I tried to run again, blindly into the fog, and then I felt it, something brushing against my arm, cold and solid. I turned, and the figure was gone. But the howl continued, closer, every note warped with my own voice, twisting into a melody of terror I couldn't escape. I didn't know if I was screaming or if it was the forest screaming through me. I didn't know if I was running or if the forest had stopped moving and I was trapped in place. And above it all, that voice, mine, pleading, mocking, impossible to silence. I realized then that there was no escape. The forest wasn't just around me. It was me. And I was already part of it. I don't know how long I wandered, if it was hours or days. Time had dissolved into fog and shadow. Every step felt like moving through water. Yet the forest seemed to guide me, herding me deeper into its heart. My ankle throbbed constantly. My hands were raw from clawing at branches, and the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves was so thick I could taste it, and the voice, it never stopped. My voice, calling, pleading, mocking. I could feel it inside my skull, pressing against my thoughts, merging with them. Every time I tried to think of myself as separate, it whispered, "You are not separate. You are mine." I stumbled into another clearing. This one was different. The mist swirled like smoke caught in a breeze, forming shapes that looked like people, but not people. My own face, my own body, frozen in twisted positions. Some crouched on the ground, others reaching outward as if begging for help. Their eyes glinted in the pale light, mirrors of my own panic. Then I saw the original figure again, standing still, almost perfectly still, at the edge of the clearing. I froze. Its eyes, my eyes, studied me. And in its voice, my voice, it said, "Now you understand." I wanted to speak, to run, to fight, but the fog thickened around me. The ground beneath my feet softened, and I felt roots snaking up from the soil, wrapping around my legs, pulling me down. Panic erupted in me. I thrashed, screamed, but the forest had grown stronger than my will. It had learned how I moved, how I struggled, how I feared. It anticipated every reaction, and then I realized something worse. The voice, the howl. It wasn't just my voice, it was me. Every memory, every inflection, every note of desperation had been recorded, absorbed, twisted into this endless echo, and now it was feeding on me. Every scream I tried to give, every thought of escape, became fuel. I stopped struggling, because struggling only made it stronger. I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to think, trying to find a sliver of reason. My mind spun in loops, yet something inside me, a small, stubborn part, noticed a pattern in the mist. The echoes weren't random. They were forming shapes, patterns I could almost follow, paths the forest was forcing me to take. I limped forward, guided by instinct and dread. Each step brought the mist closer until the echoes of my voice were all around me, each one a thread pulling at my identity. The figure, my figure, followed, gliding over roots and soil with impossible ease. I could feel it drawing nearer, its presence pressing into me like a hand on my shoulder. I came upon a small hollow, surrounded by gnarled trees. The ground was littered with old leaves, broken branches, and most disturbingly, my own belongings. My journal, my backpack, even the recorder I had thought lost forever. Everything arranged neatly, almost ceremoniously, as if the forest itself were setting a stage. And in the center, carved into the mud, words that made my stomach turn. Your voice belongs to me now. The howl began again, and I recognized it instantly. Not distant, not twisted by the mountains. This time it came from inside me, resonating through my chest, my throat, my skull. Every scream, every whisper, every plea I had ever made in fear echoed outward, and behind it I felt the presence, my double, my mirror, the forest's puppet, pressing closer, absorbing, feeding, teaching. I tried to pull away, but the roots had me, and the mist was thicker now, almost solid. I could feel it curling around my arms, my legs, my torso. My voice rose with the howl, and yet I was no longer certain it belonged to me. Each note was mirrored, distorted, and returned, layering until I couldn't separate my own thoughts from the echo. The figure stepped forward, closer. I could see my reflection in its dark, misted eyes. And then, impossibly, it spoke again, using my voice. Join me. A part of me wanted to resist, to fight, to scream for help. But the forest had learned me too well. Resistance only made the pain sharper, the echo louder, the roots tighter. And in that moment I understood the truth. This was no accident. The forest didn't just hunt, it consumed. It didn't just mimic, it became. And now it wanted me. I forced one final scream, a raw primal cry of defiance. The figure hesitated, the mist pulsed violently, and then it flowed into me, through me. I felt my identity fragments scattering into echoes that layered atop the howl. The pain was excruciating, yet hypnotic. I screamed, and it screamed through me. And for the first time, I wasn't sure where I ended and it began. And then silence, or something like it. The fog cleared slightly, but the forest felt altered. The echoes had stopped, yet a faint hum lingered beneath my skin. I stumbled forward, exhausted, my legs unsteady, my mind frayed. The forest was still, too still, as though it were waiting for something, or someone. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every shadow reminded me of that figure, every whisper of wind of my own stolen voice. And as I limped onward, I realized the terrifying truth. I was still here, still alive, but not the same. Something within me had been taken, twisted, mirrored in ways I couldn't comprehend. I could no longer trust my own voice. The first thing I remember is the way the air shifted, how it felt heavier, older, like the forest itself was drawing a breath the moment we stepped out of the truck. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, looking at the clearing where we'd camped the summer before, feeling that strange weight settle over my shoulders. Last year, this place had been open, almost meadow-like, but that morning, it felt different. Denser, as if the woods had grown inward during the months we'd been gone, like the trees themselves had memories and weren't sure whether they wanted us back. My name doesn't matter as much as who I was when I walked into that forest. I was 29, stubborn, convinced that experience was the same thing as wisdom. I thought that because I'd camped since I was a kid, because I'd hiked more miles than I'd driven highways, I knew how the woods worked. I thought the rules were simple. Respect the land, leave no trace, keep your fire controlled, watch the weather, watch the wildlife, and the forest would respect you back. But respect isn't something the wild gives you, it's something you earn. And even then, it can still decide to remind you who's really in charge. We had come back to this place because it felt honest. We'd visited a lot of campsites over the years, some crowded, some too groomed, some too close to town. But this place was tucked deep into the northern timber, down a fire road that barely existed, and then another mile through trees thick enough you had to push them aside with your shoulders. Last summer, it felt untouched, almost sacred in a way that made you lower your voice without knowing why. It wasn't just beautiful. It felt like a secret, one the world hadn't gotten to yet. So when we stepped into that clearing again, I expected a flood of old memories. The laughter, the fire crackling, the smell of pine sap melting in the heat. I expected familiarity, comfort. But what I felt instead was recognition. The kind you get when you walk into a room where someone's been waiting for you. The first thing we noticed was the circle. Right there in the center of the clearing, in the exact spot where we'd built our fire last year, was a blackened ring of earth. Burned. Charred. The ash pattern almost identical to the one we'd left behind, but we had raked ours clean before we left. I remembered that clearly. We'd smothered the coals with dirt, poured water, stirred it, repeated the process until it was cold enough to touch. We'd been proud of that. Responsible campers. People who did things right. But this circle, this one, was still warm. I crouched down, touched the edge of the soil with the back of my hand, and felt the faintest heat. Not enough to burn, not enough to call recent, just enough to feel wrong. The ash smelled old and fresh at the same time, like something that had burned years ago but hadn't stopped burning completely. And surrounding it, this was the part that froze me, was a ring of trees that hadn't been there last summer. I don't mean saplings. These were young trees, yes, but not new. Thin fir trunks rising 6 or 7 feet high, a tight circle around the fire pit like soldiers guarding it. Last year, this clearing had been open space. I remembered walking across it without stepping over a single root. Now it felt bottled in, surrounded, contained, and the trees weren't spaced naturally, they were arranged. Evenly, deliberately, as if someone or something wanted them there. When you camp long enough, you learn not to jump to conclusions. Nature is strange, the woods evolve fast, storms drop trees, seeds travel, animals reshape the landscape in ways that often look intentional, but aren't. So at first I told myself it was just growth, just coincidence. But the truth sat on my tongue like a stone. Trees don't grow 6 feet in a year. Not here. Not in soil this thin. And they definitely don't grow in perfect circles around old fire pits. Something was wrong. But stubbornness can be louder than instinct, and sometimes pride talks you into staying somewhere your gut is begging you to leave. We'd come all this way. We'd planned this trip for months, and the forest, whatever it had done, whatever it was doing, wasn't going to chase us out before we even set up camp. That was the lie I told myself anyway. I tried to laugh it off, said something like, "Looks like someone beat us to our spot," but the words felt hollow. The clearing didn't feel used. No footprints, no tire tracks, no trash, no broken branches. Just that fire circle, warm as breath, surrounded by trees that shouldn't exist. Still, we unpacked, set up the tent, gathered firewood, and with every minute that passed, the forest grew quieter. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in around you, the kind that feels like watching, the kind that makes you speak softer without understanding why. I felt it strongest when I walked the perimeter of the clearing alone. Last year, the boundaries had been open lines where the underbrush faded into brown needles. Now it felt like the brush had been pushed back, cleared almost, to form a clean ring around us. No branches sticking out, no shrubs, just a perfect circular space, as if the forest had decided where the camp belonged and carved the shape itself. I should have left then, but we're good at ignoring the signs nature gives us, especially when we think we're the ones in control. As evening fell, the tension eased just enough for us to feel normal again. We cooked, we talked, we laughed a little more freely. The warmth of the fire did what fire always does. It made the world smaller, safer, easier to believe in. But every so often I'd look past the flicker of the flames, and those young fir trees would sway even though there was no wind. Every so often I'd hear something behind them, a footstep, a shift of weight, a whisper of bark. But when I turned, there was nothing. And the strangest part? The smoke didn't rise straight up. It drifted toward the trees, pulled, almost, like it was being drawn to something deeper between the trunks. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to break the fragile sense of calm we'd managed to build. But somewhere deep inside, a part of me, the part that still believed the forest could sense things we couldn't, was whispering that we weren't just camping in the woods. We were being remembered. And memory in the wild is never just a gentle thing. The fire cracked like a spine giving way under pressure, and for a moment the sparks rose high enough to light the tops of the young firs encircling us. Their needles glistened in the glow as if wet, as if they'd been rained on even though the sky had been clear all day. I watched the light ripple across their bark, watched how the shadows bent in ways shadows aren't supposed to bend, and a cold sensation slid down my back, a slow, creeping understanding that the circle wasn't just a coincidence, and it wasn't just nature reclaiming land. It felt intentional. I tried to shake it off. Fear makes patterns out of anything. The human mind is desperate for logic when placed somewhere older and wilder than itself. Maybe that's why I stood up and stretched like I was just restless, walked toward the edge of the clearing, and pretended I didn't feel the air shift with every step. The warmth of the fire faded behind me, and what replaced it was a kind of stillness that felt almost alive. The cold there wasn't the cold of night, it was the cold of breath held in a throat, of something waiting to exhale. When I reached the first of the firs, I stopped. The branches were too symmetrical, too evenly spaced. They formed not a natural perimeter, but a boundary, and the dirt beneath them was uniform. Not a pine cone, not a fallen needle, not a twig. As if the forest had swept this place, prepared it. I knelt, ran my hand over the soil, and felt an unexpected warmth, not just from my imagination, not the lingering heat of daylight, a steady pulse, faint but real, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. I jerked my hand back before I could stop myself. That was the moment the fear settled in fully. Before then, it had only been suspicion, unease, the kind of tension that comes from knowing something's off but refusing to admit it. But the ground shouldn't have pulsed. Dirt doesn't warm in rhythmic waves. Soil doesn't breathe beneath your palm. I stood there a long moment, staring at the circle of trees, feeling the fire at my back and the forest pressing in front of me. I could hear the faintest shifting, leaves brushing leaves, branches knocking together softly, but the air was still, dead still. And everything in me whispered the same impossible thought. It knows us. When I returned to the fire, I didn't mention what I'd felt. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Thermal pockets, trapped heat, roots moving in the soil. I lied to myself because the truth was too large to face alone, and because saying it out loud would have made it real. But the night had only just begun. We stayed close to the flames, talking quieter as the stars came out. The sky above the clearing was pinpricked with light, but around us the trees seemed to drink the darkness, pulling it into their branches until the edges of our camp were swallowed in a kind of black that didn't feel natural. It didn't even feel like night. It felt like curtains closing on a stage. And that fire pit, the one that had been warm when we arrived, began to smoke again. At first it was subtle, just a faint wisp rising between the flames. Then it thickened, curling upward in a thin stream that didn't behave like normal smoke. It didn't drift, it traveled, sliding across the ground, creeping toward the circle of firs, disappearing between their trunks like water seeping through cracks. I stared at it until the words finally slipped out of me without permission. Do you see that? There was a long pause, and then a quiet, uneasy yes. For a while, none of us spoke. We just watched the smoke bleed away from our fire, watched the trees absorb it, or swallow it, or breathe it in, and I felt something unsettling rise from memory. Last summer, the smoke had stayed centered. It had spiraled upward in a clean white column, drifting harmlessly into the open air. It had been safe then, familiar. But this smoke, it was being taken. I felt the forest watching us, not as a presence somewhere out there, but as a shape surrounding us. The circle of trees, the pulsing earth, the old fire pit, somehow still alive under ash, it was all connected, all part of something larger than us, something with patience, with memory. And just as I was about to suggest we turn in early, something moved. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift behind the trees like a footstep placed carefully. A weight settling into soil. Then another, and another. Slow, deliberate, circling us from beyond the boundary. I held my breath, listening, counting each step in the pattern of a slow orbit. Whatever was out there wasn't random. It was pacing, watching, measuring. I leaned forward slightly and the fire popped. sending a spray of sparks into the air. For a split second, they illuminated the trees behind us and something in the space between them. Something tall, too tall to be human. A faint silhouette that vanished the instant the light died. My heartbeat thudded in my throat, so loud it drowned out the night. I didn't move, didn't speak. Every instinct inside me, every lesson I'd ever learned from the wilderness, told me the same thing. Don't run, don't startle, don't provoke. But fear doesn't listen to instincts. Fear listens to imagination, and imagination fills the silence with danger. The footsteps stopped. Complete stillness. The kind that means something out there is holding its breath at the same time you are. And then, very faintly, almost gently, I heard a whisper. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was more like a sound shaped like speech, the cadence of language without meaning. And it came from every direction at once, between the trees. Behind them, beneath them. A shiver rippled through the clearing, and the smoke, drifting toward the first, suddenly reversed, snapping back toward the fire as if inhaled by something unseen. The forest exhaled, and the temperature dropped. I looked at the circle of trees, not at the branches, not at the trunks, but at the shadows between them. And that's when I understood. The reason the fire pit was still warm, the reason the trees grew where no trees should. The reason the forest felt like it had been waiting. It wasn't remembering our campfire, it was remembering us. And memory, once awakened, doesn't let go easily. The cold that swept through the clearing wasn't just a temperature shift. It felt like a presence sliding across my skin. A deliberate touch from something that didn't belong to any world I understood. The flames bent inward, pulled by the same force that tugged at the smoke. And for a moment, the fire itself dimmed, shrinking into a tight coil of red embers before flaring back to life as if gasping for air. I felt my breath hitch. Instinct told me to stand, to move, to do something. But fear pinned me exactly where I was. The woods had always been a place where I felt capable, strong, resourceful. Out here, survival wasn't a theory. It was muscle memory. Fire, shelter, water, terrain awareness, reading signs, following instincts. But none of that training helped me in that moment, because the rules I knew weren't the rules being used against us. Whatever was out there wasn't following animal patterns. It wasn't curious like a deer or bold like a bear. It wasn't territorial like a mountain lion or cautious like a wolf. No, this was patience, calculation, a kind of ancient watchfulness that didn't move through the world the same way we did. The whisper rose again, not louder, a little clearer, closer. I could feel the vibrations of the sound not in my ears, but in the back of my spine, traveling upward like someone dragging a cold fingertip along each vertebra. I turned toward the trees, toward the place where the sounds seemed to gather, and the shadows shifted with a slow, unnatural grace. Not a swaying of branches, not movement caused by wind, movement caused by intention. Something was stepping forward. But before my eyes could make sense of the shape, the fire snapped loudly, so violently the flames burst outward in a sudden roar, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The shadows retreated at once, melting back into the tight ranks of the young first, leaving only silence behind. The others stared into the darkness with expressions that matched my own. Disbelief layered over fear, held together only by the thin thread of denial humans cling to when reality starts bending. What was that? The question came out barely above a whisper. I didn't answer because I didn't know what to say, because I didn't trust my voice to stay steady, because part of me was still waiting for the forest to answer instead. The fire settled again, flickering in shallow breaths. The clearing felt smaller now, the air felt heavier, and every second that passed carried the same unnerving truth. Whatever had been circling us wasn't gone. It was just out of sight. I knew then that sleep wasn't happening that night. Not for me. My instincts were screaming to stay alert, to stay awake, to keep the fire alive. Fire means safety. Fire means protection. But what happens when the forest isn't afraid of fire? I made myself look up. The new trees surrounding us, their needles reflected the flames in a way I hadn't noticed before. Each one glowed faintly, as if coated in a sheen of moisture or resin, and they leaned not straight, not upright, but very slightly inward, as if reaching, as if listening, as if remembering. A rustle drifted from behind those trunks, soft, rhythmic, like someone brushing their palms against the bark while walking in circles. It continued for nearly a minute before stopping abruptly, leaving behind an emptiness so sharp I felt it in my chest. That's when the smell hit. Not smoke, something older. Damp soil, decaying leaves, wet bark, the scent of something unearthed. A deep forest smell that doesn't come from trees but from the ground beneath them, from layers of rot so ancient they've turned sweet. Slowly, the realization crawled across my mind, the warmth in the fire pit, the pulse beneath the soil, the whispering, the circling. It wasn't the forest remembering our fire, it was the forest reenacting it. Something had watched us last year, watched how we built our fire, watched how we laughed, watched how we moved. Something had held on to that memory, buried it, tended it, fed it with time, until the moment we stepped back into its clearing and awakened what it had kept waiting. And now it wanted something. The problem was, I didn't know what. As the night deepened, the fire shrank lower. I stoked it repeatedly, adding log after log until the pile should have lasted an hour, but every piece of wood burned too fast, like dry leaves instead of solid pine. The flames glowed white-hot, devouring the wood almost instantly, leaving behind coals that pulsed with unnatural brightness. The forest was hungry, and it was using our fire to feed itself. At least, that's what it felt like. The way each log ignited too quickly, the way the smoke kept bending toward the trees, the way the clearing seemed to dim every time the fire dimmed. I didn't want to admit it aloud, but I knew. I knew with a certainty that sank into my bones. We weren't the campers this time. We were the offering. At some point, the whispering stopped entirely. The pacing stopped. The shifting behind the trees went silent, and that silence was worse than all the noise before it, because it meant whatever was watching didn't need to watch anymore. It already knew what would happen next. I leaned close to the fire, staring into the embers like they might tell me something, give me a way out or a warning or a sign. But all I saw was the faint outline of last year's ashes beneath the new coals. Still warm. Still waiting. And then, from the darkness, something moved again. Not footsteps. Not a whisper. A shape. Stepping between two firs, slow and tall and silent, as if the forest itself had peeled off a piece of its shadow and given it legs. I froze, because whatever it wasn't human. And it wasn't an animal. It was something the forest made, something the forest kept, something the forest remembered. The fire snapped once more, and the shape froze at the very edge of the clearing. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't blink. And I knew, deep down without question, we were not supposed to come back here. We had returned to a place that didn't forget, a place that didn't forgive, a place that had waited an entire year for us. The shape didn't blink, didn't sway, didn't even seem to breathe. It stood at the threshold of the clearing like it was testing the boundary between its world and ours. A boundary I was no longer sure existed. The firelight reached only so far, and whatever stood beyond that reach was made of angles that didn't look right, of shadows that refused to settle. Its outline was tall, far taller than any person, and thin in a way that made the trees behind it appear almost swollen by comparison. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its attention, sharp and direct, like the weight of a hand pressing down on the center of my chest. I wanted to speak, to whisper something rational. There must be a logical explanation. It's just a trick of the light. It's just the woods playing with your mind. But the words died before they reached my tongue. Because logic had fled this place the moment we stepped into the clearing. And the woods weren't playing with us. They were studying us. The fire crackled, louder this time, almost like a warning. The flames climbed higher for a moment, and in that brief flare of light, the figure stepped back just slightly, withdrawing into the shadows, only an inch or two. But it was enough. Enough to tell me that the fire meant something to it. Enough to tell me that the boundary wasn't physical, it was something older. That was when I remembered something I'd heard once from a local ranger. in a different forest, on a different trail. He'd said the woods are like a living memory. Whatever you do in them settles into the ground like sediment, building layers over time. He wasn't talking about magic, he meant impact, erosion, the way human footprints can change the path of animals for generations. But what if some forests remember differently? What if some forests don't just hold memory, they become it? A slow, steady breath left the shadows, low enough to shake the ground in a faint tremor. The figure didn't advance. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching, waiting. And the silence stretched so long it felt like the air itself might suffocate from holding still. Behind me, the fire began to flicker unnaturally fast. Flames rising, falling, rising again, as if struggling for oxygen. That made no sense. The night was calm, no wind, no drafts, and yet the fire danced like it was being pushed from all sides, smothered and stoked at the same time. The ground beneath me pulsed again, a steady, rhythmic beat, slow, measured, alive. I forced myself to look away from the shadow, just for a moment, and stare down at the soil near my boots. The ash from the old fire pit was glowing faintly beneath the top layer of dirt, a soft red, a quiet ember, like something underground was burning, feeding heat through the earth in slow waves. The realization sobered me with a clarity so sharp it hurt. The fire last summer, it hadn't died. No matter how well we thought we'd extinguished it, something had held onto that flame, buried it, preserved it, not as fire, but as memory. And what does a forest do with a memory? It repeats it, replays it, rebuilds it. The warm ash we found on arrival, the smoke bending toward the trees, the young firs forming a perfect circle, the pulsing soil, the shadow that moved in patterns too deliberate to be random. This wasn't a haunting. It was a reenactment, a ritual, and we were standing in the center of it. The figure stepped forward, just one slow stride. The sound was soft, soil shifting beneath enormous weight, bark brushing bark as its limbs scraped against the nearest trees. For the first time, I saw movement inside its silhouette, like branches interlocking, like roots pulling free from the ground. Its arm, if that's what it was, extended slightly into the dim light, revealing a texture that didn't belong to any animal. Rough, ridged like wood. My throat tightened. A cold sweat broke across my skin. I had the terrible, undeniable thought, the forest didn't grow these trees to surround the fire. The forest grew these trees to shape something else, a form, a vessel, a guardian, or a reminder. I didn't know which one was worse. The fire dimmed again, and for the first time the figure moved without hesitation. One long step, then another. The boundary had shifted. Whatever place had once been untouchable to it was now open. I scrambled backward, nearly falling into the tent behind me. My palms hit the ground hard, sending little clouds of ash into the air. The smell of last year's burnt pine rushed up around me, thick enough to sting my throat. And beneath that smoky scent, something sweeter. Rotting leaves, wet moss, the smell of decay rising from below. The creature's outline entered the outer edge of the firelight. Details took shape. Its limbs were long, but not smooth, each segment made of twisting bark-covered sinew like muscles carved from living trees. Its torso was narrow, almost hollow, with faint red light pulsing between the cracks as if embers glowed inside its chest. Its face, if it had one, was indistinct, a mass of shadows shaped like a skull without features, crowned by branches that grew upward like antlers. When it breathed, the air trembled. A sound followed, low, resonant, impossible to compare to anything living. Not a growl, not a word. Something like the echo of trees groaning in a storm, the creak of old wood under unbearable weight. And then it raised its head. The forest around us shifted with it. Every branch, every trunk, every shadow, as if the entire clearing inhaled. A heat surged beneath the soil, racing outward from the fire pit. I felt it under my hands, under my knees, spreading in a perfect circle. The young firs surrounding us shuddered once, tilting inward even more. And the creature stepped fully into the clearing. Nothing in the wild prepares you for the moment you realize the woods aren't just a place. They're a presence. The forest didn't remember our campfire. It remembered what we left behind, and it wanted us to finish what we started. The creature paused in the full glow of the fire, its body absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. The flames bent toward it, subtle at first, then unmistakably, as if drawn by the empty spaces in its bark-like chest. The clearing no longer felt like a clearing. It felt like a room with walls that leaned in, listening. I couldn't move. My breath stayed locked in my lungs, trembling against my ribs until it finally spilled out in a shaky exhale. The creature tilted its head toward the sound, not abruptly, not with the sharp alertness of an animal, but slowly, deliberately, like a memory turning over in its sleep. The forest pulsed with it. The fire pit at my feet glowed brighter. The soil trembled in small, contained ripples, each one radiating outward like the beat of a buried drum. I realized then that the pulse wasn't just beneath me. It was beneath everything, a living rhythm under the earth. A heartbeat too vast to imagine. My own heartbeat staggered trying to match it, faster, then slower, then erratic. A nausea climbed through my stomach, the kind that comes when your body recognizes a truth your mind refuses to accept. The forest is alive. Not alive the way biology books describe it. Alive the way a memory is alive. Alive the way a ritual is alive. The creature stepped closer. When it moved, the ground shifted first, tiny tremors rolling away from its feet before it lifted a single limb. It was connected to the soil in a literal sense, as though its steps were guided not by muscle but by whatever pulsed beneath the surface. I tried to push myself backward, but my hands slipped in the soft dirt. Ash streaked my palms, coating my skin in the remnants of last year's fire. The creature's antler-like branches swayed gently, brushing the tops of the firs with a whisper so soft it sounded like breath. And then it spoke. Not in language, not in something human. It was the crack of frozen branches splitting in winter, the groan of trunks bending under decades of weight, the rattle of leaves in a wind that wasn't there. It wasn't communicating through sound, it was communicating through memory. The forest wasn't telling us a story, it was reminding us of one. My chest tightened as I understood the meaning behind the pulse in the earth, the warmth in the ash, the trees arranged like an audience around a forgotten stage. We had burned here once, the forest had watched, the fire had touched something beneath the soil, and now, 1 year later, the forest had rebuilt what we destroyed. Not the fire pit, not the clearing, but the moment. And in rebuilding it, the forest expected us to take our place. The creature's long, bark-cracked arm reached toward the fire pit, pointing not at the flames, but at the ring of ash beneath them. The circle we made last year, the circle we thought we had erased. The creature's chest flared with a faint ember-red glow. It breathed in. The fire dimmed. It breathed out. The fire surged. The forest wanted something from us. Something specific. A repetition. A reenactment. A completion. I felt the pressure of the moment tightening around my ribs, constricting like vines that had grown inward. The creature didn't need to speak in words to tell me what it remembered. Last year, before leaving, I had said something out loud, something I had meant symbolically, something people say without thinking. We'll come back next year. We'll finish what we started. I blinked hard, my breath catching. Did I really say that? Yes. I had. Carelessly, softly, into the smoke, into the dark, into the forest. And the forest had heard me. The creature took another step, and the young fir trees behind it leaned inward again, bending as though bowing to its presence. Their needles whispered together in a sound like dry rain. The soil pulsed harder. The fire pit brightened. The creature lowered its head as if listening, not to us, but to something deeper, older, calling from beneath the ground. In that moment, the truth settled over me like cold stone. The forest wasn't punishing us. It wasn't hunting us. It wasn't haunting us. It was honoring an invitation, a promise we didn't know we made, a ritual we had accidentally joined, and now it wanted us to fulfill our part. I stared at the creature, at the hollow glow inside its chest, at the roots that twined beneath its feet, at the branches forming its crown, and in its silhouette I saw something impossible, a shape carved by memory, a form built from the forest's own understanding of us. It wasn't here to kill. It wasn't here to chase us away. It was here because we came back, because memory is a kind of gravity, and the forest remembers everything. The creature took one final step, close enough now that the fire warped around it, flames bending sideways like metal under a magnet, close enough that I could smell the wet, ancient rot of its breath, close enough that I could finally see what lay within the hollow of its chest. A faint glow of last year's coals. Our coals. Our fire. Living inside it. Still burning. Waiting for us. My breath broke in a sharp gasp, because the forest had not just remembered the fire, it had kept it, protected it, preserved it, fed it, and now it wanted us to take it back. The creature reached out with its long, bark-clad arm and offered the ember to us. Its glow flickered across the clearing, across the trees, across my face, across everything we thought we understood about the wild. I didn't know what would happen if I refused. I didn't know what would happen if I accepted. All I knew was that the forest remembers promises, and it does not forget. The ember pulsed in the creature's open palm, if it could even be called a palm. Its hand looked more like a cluster of roots fused together, each one flexing with slow, sinewy intention. The glow inside them flickered like a trapped heartbeat, a heartbeat that belonged to us, a heartbeat the forest had preserved all year, waiting for the moment we returned to claim it. The creature stood motionless, offering the ember with a patience that felt older than the land itself. The fire beside us twisted in confusion, leaning toward the ember, then snapping back toward the creature, as if torn between the memory it once was and the memory it had become. My breath trembled, my hands shook, my mind raced. But deep beneath the panic was something worse: recognition. Last year, just before we smothered the fire, I remember leaning over the pit and saying quietly, half joking, half honest, "This fire doesn't get to die here. We'll bring it back next summer." And the forest heard it. Maybe it wasn't words the forest understood. Maybe it wasn't language. Maybe it was intent. Breath. Warmth. Motion. The offering of a thought into a place that treats every thought like a seed. I hadn't promised the fire anything, but the fire had accepted it anyway. And now the creature was holding the promise in its hand, shaped into something living. The ember brightened, casting a soft red glow across the creature's chest, illuminating the cavernous hollow where countless other faint embers flickered. Old fires, old promises, old campers who had spoken vows they never meant to keep. Some embers glowed steady. Others pulsed weakly, fading. A few were nothing but ash. The creature leaned slightly toward me, the movement slow and deliberate, as if following a ritual that could not be broken. Its shadow stretched across the ground like an ink spill. The young fir trees surrounding the clearing bowed with its movement, their branches lowering in unison, forming a living ring of green and darkness. The forest was waiting, expectant, silent, demanding. I swallowed hard. "What does it want?" I whispered, even though I already knew. To finish what we started, to restore what we left behind, to fulfill a promise made without understanding its weight. The creature's arm extended further. The ember glowed brighter. Its heat pressed against my face, gentle, warm, familiar. The kind of heat that comes not from destruction, but from companionship, from a fire built with intention, shared with friends, tended with care. It was our fire, but it no longer belonged to us. It belonged to the forest's memory of us. My knees weakened, and I found myself raising a hand toward the ember, not willingly, not consciously, but drawn by something deeper than instinct, a pull that felt ancient, a pull that felt like belonging. But as my fingers neared the ember, the forest reacted. The trees inhaled. Every needle on every branch lifted slightly, as if electrified by the moment. The fire pit beneath us trembled in a low, rhythmic pulse, thump, 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 like the land itself had a heartbeat. The air thickened with heat and cold at the same time. Something was about to happen, but then a sharp crack rang out behind me, not from the forest, from one of us. A branch breaking under a panicked step, a gasp, a stifled cry, and the moment shattered. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, so fast, so violently, the air seemed to tear around it. Its antler-like branches scraped against the furs, dropping showers of needles that floated like ash around its body. The ember for the first time flickered in uncertainty. And before I could think, before I could breathe, before I could decide, the creature stepped toward the one who had made the sound. Not at me, at the movement, at the weakness, at the fear. A deep, unearthly groan rippled through the forest. The ground convulsed in a sudden wave. The trees shuddered as if trying to pull their roots free from the soil. The creature raised the ember again, but not as an offering this time, as judgment, its chest filled with crimson light. The ground beneath us heated until the soil smoked. A sound like 1,000 leaves tearing at once roared through the clearing, and the creature's arm, long, rooted, impossibly strong, swept down toward the source of the panic. I lunged before thinking, grabbed the creature's arm with both hands, and felt heat rush up my arms like molten sap. Its bark-covered skin was alive, flexing, tightening, twisting against my grip. The ember flared in its other hand, casting a red glow across its faceless head. For the first time, it turned fully toward me. And I understood the truth. The forest didn't want to kill us. The forest didn't want to drive us away. The forest wanted us to complete the memory, to stand in the roles we played last year, to rekindle the fire exactly as before, to follow the ritual we unknowingly started. And if we didn't choose to do it, the forest would force us. Heat surged beneath my feet, and the ground split slightly around the fire pit, releasing a breath of ancient warmth. The creature towered above me, its ember held between us like a beating heart. But I held onto its arm anyway, because if it reached the others, it wouldn't stop. The ember flared again, and in the pulsing red light I saw something inside it, a reflection. Not of me, not of the forest, but of last year's fire, the one we let die too soon, the one we promised to rekindle. The creature twisted its arm free, effortlessly, and lowered the ember toward me. Lower, lower, until it hovered just inches above my palms. I didn't have time to move. I didn't have time to refuse. The forest had already decided. The ember dropped and landed in my hands, and the moment it touched my skin, the forest exhaled. The trees leaned inward, the ground pulsed in a rhythmic heartbeat, and the fire behind me roared to life as if remembering exactly what came next. The ember sank into my palms without burning. It should have scorched straight through my skin, should have blistered and seared, but instead, the heat settled deep into my bones, spreading through my arms like warm breath pressing outward from inside my veins. A pressure gathered in my chest, pulling me forward, pulling me into the memory the forest had held on to all year. The creature stood perfectly still as I clutched the ember, its towering form silent, expectant, the forest's entire weight pressing down through it. The young firs around the clearing leaned inward until their branches nearly touched the ground, forming a living dome over us, blocking out the stars, smothering the cold air, sealing us in a circle that felt more like a ritual chamber than anything built by nature. Behind me, the fire roared back to life. Not the fire we'd built that evening, but something older, brighter, deeper. The flames leapt in twisting shapes that weren't entirely random, curling in spirals that mirrored the rings in the creature's bark, the patterns in the soil, the rhythm pulsing beneath the earth. The forest wasn't just watching, it was participating. My hands glowed with ember light. The heat was rising, rising, until the world around me blurred at the edges. The creature stepped back, not retreating, but bowing, its antlered silhouette dipping low toward the earth. The other trees followed, their trunks bending with the strain of something ancient moving through them. And somewhere inside that heavy darkness, the truth clicked into place. We were not the threat. We were the missing piece. A fire remembered needs a flame. A memory that begins needs an ending. A promise spoken needs to be fulfilled. And the forest, alive, ancient, listening, had waited an entire year for this moment. My knees buckled under the weight of everything happening, but I stayed upright, not because of strength, not because of courage, because the forest was holding me there, supporting me as much as it was containing me. The ember pulsed once more, and then It broke, not shattered, opened. The ember split along an invisible seam, blooming like a flower of molten coal. A small flame rose from its center, delicate as a candle wick, wavering between my palms. The glow wrapped my hands in a faint halo of red-gold light, casting thin shadows on the ground that danced in time with the heartbeat beneath the soil. The creature rose from its bough. Its hollow chest brightened. The young fir straightened, and the forest leaned closer. I felt my breath leave me in one long exhale, as if the flame had taken it from me. The little fire hovered above my palms, weightless and warm, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the forest's heartbeat, and I realized this was the fire we had made last summer. Not a metaphor, not a memory, the actual flame, preserved in whatever realm the forest occupies when humans aren't watching. The creature tilted its head, slow, deliberate, reverent, and then gestured toward the center of the clearing, toward the old fire pit, toward the circle we had created and abandoned. The flame in my hands flickered, almost like it understood what the creature wanted, what the forest wanted, what the memory required. I turned toward the pit. The soil glowed faintly with buried heat. Ash from last year lingered beneath the surface like an exposed scar. The circle felt alive, and as I stepped closer, the trees surrounding us leaned again, opening a pathway, a corridor of branches to the place where the ritual had paused 1 year ago. I knelt at the edge of the fire pit. My breath trembled, my hands hovered above the soil, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt two worlds overlapping. Ours, and the forest's, past and present, memory and reenactment. This wasn't a trap. This wasn't vengeance. This was completion. A year ago, we left before the fire died. A year ago, I promised, without meaning to, that we'd finish what we started. A year ago, the forest listened and waited and remembered. I lowered the ember flame toward the pit. The heartbeat beneath the soil surged. The creature behind me inhaled deeply, its antlers scraping the canopy. The young firs trembled in anticipation. And the moment the ember touched the ash, the ground ignited, not in an explosion, not in a blaze, in a bloom. A ring of flame rose from the soil, tracing the exact circle we had built the year before. The fire grew upward in a spiral, bright and controlled, filling the clearing with heat and light that felt purifying instead of destructive. The flames danced in patterns that should not have been possible, shapes resembling hands, branches, memories. The creature stepped back, watching. The trees opened. The heartbeat slowed, the forest exhaled, and a sense of completion, heavy, profound, inevitable, washed through the clearing. I understood then what the forest had demanded of us. Not obedience, not sacrifice, not fear, respect. We had taken something from this place last year, time, energy, attention, fire, and left something unfinished. The forest wasn't punishing us for that. It was correcting the imbalance, honoring the promise that I didn't realize had meaning. And once the flame rose to its full height, glowing orange and red and gold like a sun carried in cupped hands, the creature stepped back into the circle of young firs. Its form dissolved into the shadows. The trees straightened, the ground's heartbeat faded. The ritual, the memory, the reenactment was complete. The fire crackled softly now, normal again, behaving the way fire behaves everywhere else in the world. The air cleared, the oppressive stillness lifted. The young firs no longer leaned inward. They stood naturally, peacefully, as if nothing strange had ever happened. I looked down at my hands. They were empty. No burns, no ember, no glow, just hands, human again. The forest no longer felt like a presence pressing against my skin. It felt like what it used to feel like, vast, ancient, quiet, but different in one subtle, undeniable way. It acknowledged us. We stayed by the fire until the sky lightened behind the trees. I didn't sleep. I barely moved. The clearing no longer felt threatening, but I didn't dare leave the circle until dawn touched the tips of the pines. When daylight finally came, the clearing looked almost normal. The young firs still formed an impossible circle, and the fire pit still glowed faintly beneath the ash, but everything else appeared untouched by the night's ritual. Before we left, I looked back one last time. A breeze rustled the young firs. A few needles drifted to the ground. The forest didn't speak. It just remembered. And I understood then with a clarity that felt sacred. Every place in the wild keeps a story. Every footprint, every flame, every whisper left in its branches remains long after we're gone. When you camp in the deep woods, you're not entering an empty space. You're stepping into memory. And sometimes, if you speak carelessly, if you burn without respect, if you promise without understanding, the forest will wait for you to return. Not to punish you, not to frighten you, but to finish the story you began. And that is why, even now, years later, I say the same quiet prayer every time I kneel beside a fire pit. May the forest remember us kindly. May the flames die completely. And may we never promise what we cannot complete. Because somewhere out there, in a clearing surrounded by young firs that shouldn't exist, a fire still burns inside the soil, a fire that belongs to a memory, a fire that once belonged to us, a fire the forest will never forget.